It all begins at a prestigious school, where a boy ends up throwing a wad of bills in our protagonist's face. Didn't understand what was happening. Faced with this, the director asks the Lord if that boy is someone from his group, and, if so, he thinks that. Protagonist says that he had heard that name before, a while ago. The protagonist, while reviewing the documents, ends up encountering someone that he meets the girl who stole his kiss, remarking, "So, it turns out it wasn't some random stranger after all." As he walks past the same girl, she wonders what might have been. Perhaps the protagonist is now the president of Kim Jong International, commenting, "Well, this is certainly one way to go from zero to hero." She ultimately receives a message with shocking content, and judging by her expression, her roommates ask her what's wrong, why she's so surprised. However, she doesn't answer them, only saying that she has to leave. A few minutes later, the girl was waiting for someone, who ends up sneaking up and surprising her from behind. But since she didn't recognize him, she ends up giving him a suplex, crashing into the ground. However, upon realizing that it's the protagonist, he immediately apologizes. A second later, while they were walking, the protagonist told her the same thing, that she was indeed a strong person, which leads her to ask him who told him he could approach her in such a manner. The protagonist, she tells him that she'll hit him if he tries to take her from behind, but he didn't react to a kiss on the mouth, something she tells him she really didn't expect, since he had been running away from her for years, but now he's doing that. He tells her that the reason was because he was just a poor boy, incapable of giving her happiness. "You are mistaken, as that person is merely a poor student." The man, slightly annoyed by his words, informs the director that he is being disrespectful. But now he's not that old self, so he can make her happy. Words that make her blush considerably. This happened while she was almost crying with happiness. But he also tells her not to cry, arguing that he has one more question for her, whether her father is the director of the Tao Group. She confirms that he is, and that he created his own business 5 years ago, which turned out to be that very group. She reminds him that she had already told him this, but seeing that he was trying to remember, she says she can't believe he doesn't recall. He then tells her that he needs her father's help with his Kim business, Jong. However, he is interrupted by a call from in-town, who informs him that he has some new information. So Chief Chow didn't die, he committed suicide. Hearing this, the protagonist asks where he is now, because he needs to go there immediately. While the girl asked him if he was leaving, the protagonist confirmed, and, saying goodbye, told her that they would talk another day, leading her to think to herself that she hated being left in the middle of a conversation. Nevertheless, she seemed very happy because she was thinking about the protagonist. Meanwhile, the protagonist was saying that he had to return to the company as quickly as possible. However, it appeared that the protagonist was about to be run over, but before the impact occurred, another car ended up cutting in, thus helping the protagonist and preventing him from climb. Since Mr. Soo Young, who is the protagonist, is the heir to Kim Jong International, his company, he questions how the director dares to disrespect him. The boy, being hit. The person who helped him was ETO, who asked him if he was okay, but honestly, you should be asking yourself that. After this, we move on to this person, who was telling someone that the driver had failed, and Li Tao suddenly appeared, saving the driver's life. The child tells him that it doesn't matter, since he only wanted to give him a little scare, saying that 2 people present have been killed and he wasn't that stupid. And, smiling, he tells him that he will give a warning that night, so he must be prepared. Moving on to the protagonist, he asks Li Tao if he had asked him for a warning, which is why he is warning him. Words that make Li Tao quite upset, telling him that if he hadn't arrived on time, he would have been run over, something the protagonist says is fine, and that he had to tell him about the situation. Li Tao tells the protagonist that the driver was under control, but he committed suicide in the detention center, and by the time they arrived, he was already dead, leading the protagonist to remark that his opponent is quite ruthless. He himself, the protagonist went on to say that he also left a suicide note, stating that he didn't have the money to pay the compensation, so he would give his life, and at the same time, the protagonist asked him about his family, and she replied that she had divorced him a few years ago and lives alone. However, because the protagonist is very cautious, he tells him to keep an eye on her, because if someone buys the assassin and uses the driver's life as a bargaining chip, they might target his family. The one who had previously thrown a wad of cash at the protagonist, upon hearing those words, questioned how a poor bastard could possibly be. So, without further ado, Lista ends up standing up, while the protagonist tells her to take care of it. Immediately, time passes, and we move to this beautiful villa, And it's here that we discover the girl whose kiss the protagonist stole lives, a girl I neglected to mention. Her name is Ginjin. Ginjin's father, noticing his wife reluctantly serving him food, asks what's wrong. Ginjin's mother replies that Jinjin is hung up on that poor boy, referring to the protagonist, and that she also heard Jinjin went out last night and hasn't returned. However, their conversation is interrupted by Jinjin's brother, who is accompanied by his friend. The brother asks his mother why she was yelling in the mornings, and his friend, who it's worth noting is also interested in Jinjin, asks the brother's mother if Jinjin still hasn't come back. She replies that she will return soon, asking him to eat first before it gets too late. However, he agrees. Jinji doesn't want to, and he's ready to give up, but his friend, grabbing his shoulder, asks how he, a young director, could possibly lose to a poor man, a boy who sells fried Salvadoran food and drinks only water every day, to which he replies that he only has a small property and it wasn't a big deal. However, at that moment, the protagonist arrives with Jinjin. He introduces himself as the girl's boyfriend, saying that the first time, the heir to a company like that, but the protagonist doesn't respond. He proceeds to slap her, preparing to tell her that he didn't bring anything, but this time he brought some fruit. However, her brother throws the fruit away, while telling him that, like, boyfriend? Who does he think he is? He's just a poor, insignificant bastard who actually thinks he's worthy, telling her, so pick up your trash and get out. But the protagonist doesn't give up there, and, addressing the girl's father, tells him that he has a rather rude family, asking if that's how he raised them. Words that make this man gets a little angry and yells at him to shut up. Now a little calmer, he tells the protagonist that they have always valued his effort, but what kind of things he's done, telling him that he's not worthy of his daughter, so he should withdraw. Faced with such words, the protagonist wanted to respond, but, however, he is interrupted by Jinjin's father, who wants to say a few words. He introduces himself to the protagonist as Chan Chen. The young director, Cha Jin, is cynical and will soon become the president of the company. Considering this, the protagonist thought it was a grand performance, so he didn't offer his card. However, that's exactly what he ends up doing himself, telling him, "There's $1 million on that card, take it and leave," which makes the protagonist think that he doesn't want to meet that bastard, but it would be okay if he just punched him. The girl ends up saying, "How dare you use that trick?" and questions what business it is of his and why he's so eager for people to know who he is, to which he ultimately responds that he just wants. She needed to be quiet and watch what she said in his presence. At that very moment, the protagonist's attention is drawn to a beautiful girl who had some people to know that he's not a nobody, that he's someone important. Nevertheless, the protagonist, without saying a single word, proceeds to take the card. This makes him laugh, and the protagonist tells him that he seems to know it's important, but the protagonist simply hands over the card in the end, while telling him that the money was earned by his father with a lot of hard work, and he shouldn't throw it away like trash, saying, "So you don't have the right to squander it." Words that make the girl's parents feel satisfied with his response. Hearing this, the boy explodes with anger and ends up silencing the protagonist. Annoyed, he says that he is the director of a company worth more than 30 million yuan. But who is he? To which the protagonist replies that he is the president of Kim Jong. Words that shock him, as well as the girl's family. Seeing their reaction, the protagonist asks him if maybe he doesn't like it, but he thought the protagonist was just showing off, since he's too young to be the president, and asks him, "So, what's it like?" It's hard to believe that some poor nobody is the president of that huge company, and he probably thinks it's ridiculous. However, after hearing on TV that the presenter announces that, following the unexpected death of the former president of Kim Jong International, Ir Soo-yoon, only 19 years old, has taken over as president according to the will. Years old, assumed the position of president, wondering where this young man will lead them. Well, all they can do is wait, especially after the protagonist. Beside her, the protagonist proceeded to take her by the waist and then steal a succulent kiss, and after that kiss, told everyone that he is the president of the Kim Jong Group, and furthermore, a presenter on TV confirmed it, saying that he was the new president of that group, and the Kim Jong Group's current net worth is 130 billion. Hearing that, he was speechless, unable to even utter a word. Were coming out of his mouth, and he, very nervously, was telling her all of that. Well, he tells her that he suddenly remembered he had something important to do, so he was leaving. First, Silin's brother kindly approaches the protagonist, calling him brother-in-law. He tells him that he can tell at a glance that he is a true dragon. Even the girl's mother treated him more kindly, even inviting him to sit down, something she hadn't done before. While seated, the protagonist becomes serious and he tells the girl's father, who was there, that he was there on business, as the Kim Jong group hopes to cooperate with his Taishan group. However, he himself, putting aside the look in her eyes, questions if he's joking, since everyone knows he never associated with the Kim Jong group, and if he were truly a poor boy, she wouldn't hate him. But if he's the president of the Kim Jong group, then he should never come home again. Faced with this, the girl argues with her father about how you can do that, but he simply cuts her off, saying there's no room for chatting and that they need to take the visitor outside. However, the protagonist, pulling out his phone, tells him that it doesn't matter, since he specifically sent someone to investigate the complaint between Tai Chan and Kim Jong, which arouses his curiosity, leading him to ask what investigation he's referring to. He wants a thorough investigation, which makes the protagonist, he simply turned around and left with the others. The boy, yelling, wondered if that was a threat, while we could observe, something that awakens his curiosity by asking him what investigation is well investigated, something that makes the protagonist, he says, or rather responds, that according to what he read or researched, he tells him that, according to the survey, when he and Mr. Chow were young, however, he doesn't let the protagonist finish and, grabbing his arm, tells him that there's no problem, that he just has to go to his studio and sign. At that moment, the protagonist thanks him for that and, heading towards the office, asks if he and Mr. Chow really used to be love rivals, to which he just tells him to be quiet, because if his wife finds out about that, he's dead. Moving on to Chenhua, he was angry, because he had found out that the protagonist had made Liu Yun sign the contract. Confirming this information, he comments that Anantian will have to wait. The announcement at the Taishan Group's board of directors meeting in 2 days asked what course of action they should take, to which he simply responded that it was pointless. Since Taishan has always considered him an enemy, how could he possibly agree to the protagonist's request? Lian Jun responds by saying that, according to him, from what he understands, the protagonist was involved with Annan's daughter, and they were classmates, which makes him a little upset, and he asks why this wasn't mentioned earlier. He responds that he didn't know such important information either, that he had only just found out, and while running his hand around his neck, he asks him how the girl was delighted with that kiss from the protagonist. The protagonist, while walking through the corridors, saw people whispering if he wants to continue with this. And, well, you already know what that gesture implies. He tells him that it is not necessary, since the protagonist is just a little boy asking himself if he thinks he's going to panic, telling himself that he has already figured out how to deal with the protagonist. Going on with it, the system tells the protagonist that there are still 4 days before the deadline, asking him to please complete the task as soon as possible, which ends up depressing him a little, since, even though the contract is done, the most important thing is to investigate the truth. Orito enters the protagonist's office with information that apparently is very important. He tells the protagonist that, as he expected, he has found something surprising, telling him, so, the driver has a daughter who went to study abroad 3 years ago. That's when he started driving deliveries, or rather, trucks on that construction site. With this, the protagonist wonders if a truck driver really earns enough to have the money to send his daughter abroad, and he mentions that apparently someone has bought his life, and the other party is a werewolf who has been preparing for 3 years. Light argues that for a long time, they have been unable to find a source of funding. But as the protagonist mentioned, the opponent is too strong, and he can't help but protect himself. He tells him that he has hired bodyguards to protect him from now on, and, among themselves, saying that the protagonist was obviously a poor man, and questioning how he could be the heir to the Kim Jo company. The protagonist, upon hearing this, calling them in, all the bodyguards proceed to enter the room. He tells the protagonist that there is nothing to worry about, since everything, well, everyone, they are a retired elite special forces unit, possessing excellent skills and unwavering loyalty, which surprises the protagonist. He simply replies that they seem suitable, since he has a job for all of them. The protagonist then tells Lida that he still has a question, asking who that person is, because since he can stand alongside Che Mua, his level isn't low, and furthermore, why wasn't he at the last meeting? You respond by saying, that person's name is Lion and he isn't a member of the board of directors, but he is Che Mua's trusted advisor, and it's said that he's the one who handles a lot of things. In short, one can. It's said that he's Che Mua's most loyal dog. Che Mua asks the protagonist if he's planning to start something with him, and if that's the case, he fears that he's as tough as steel. However, he denies it, saying it's just curiosity. Moving on to the protagonist's secretary, she ends up running into Leon in the hallway. When she sees the girl, when he sees the girl, he asks her if she wasn't going to greet him, which she does. Crystallis replies by asking if he hadn't told her not to come to see her at the company. However, he tells her that he would like to hire her, asking if she would answer his call. Responds by saying, "So, do you have urgent business with her?" But she simply tells him that she has no obligation to help him. However, our protagonist, the boy who had the wad of cash thrown at him, mocked himself for the simple fact that he was poor and lived in a small town. Thought that it was true, that just 2 minutes ago he was poor, but now it's the complete opposite. And going back 20 minutes, we see how the protagonist was reading, grabs her, telling her that without him, she couldn't continue as the leader's secretary. And whether she believes it or not, he'll make her leave tomorrow, saying, "So you had to listen." Clearly his father, telling him how desperate he was and that he needed his help, or he would die. Moving on to the protagonist, he himself had just finished. As he leaves his office, he is greeted by the same bodyguards as before, who ask him where he is going, explaining that they were supposed to pick him up. He responds that he was going home after work, and then, raising his voice, he tells everyone that it was time to work, which surprises the protagonist, since everyone seemed very energetic. Then, as he passes by the secretary, after she quickly says goodbye, the protagonist stops her to tell her that her car is broken and asks if he could possibly give her a ride home, adding that if it's a bother, she can take a taxi, but the protagonist doesn't mind that, and he agrees, saying he will take her. After a while, the protagonist finally arrives at the girl's house. She thanks the protagonist for bringing her back. However, as the protagonist walks towards the girl's house, he tells her to hurry, and turning around, asks her what she sent him back, turns around, and doesn't even let her drink a glass of water, which makes her apologize, admitting that he was right. This bodyguard was whispering to his partner, or rather, asking if they were going to which his partner replied by asking if he was stupid. If he couldn't see that a news alert pops up on his phone, reporting that the director of Kim Jong International passed away in an accident that morning. However, the protagonist dismisses it as untrue. Protagonist was going to drink that water all night, literally. They thought the protagonist was going to do some fun things with the girl. This happens upon entering the house. The girl ends up apologizing to the protagonist because her place was a little messy, but the protagonist tells her it's no problem, since he used to live in a dorm room that was even messier than that. The protagonist sits down and notices one of the girl's articles of clothing hanging on the couch, which prompts the protagonist to tell her that it seems all her energy is focused solely on her work, but the girl, quite embarrassed, just tells him not to move from there, as she'll be right back with a little water. And while in the kitchen, holding and looking at a strange pill, she remembers how Leon had told her to find, or rather, to find an opportunity to spend some time alone with the protagonist, and then give him that medicine, so that the protagonist loses consciousness, and she could take a few photos of herself kissing the protagonist. After remembering this, she decides to go ahead with her plan. Upon returning to the protagonist, she finds him, as he was looking at a portrait of her and her mother. That being said, after the girl gives the protagonist the water, he tells her that he actually has something to ask her, questioning her about her relationship with Leon. The girl, very nervous, answers that they have nothing to do with each other, that they just happen to share the same last name, to which the protagonist, feigning innocence, says that's right. The protagonist, as he was about to, it's none of his business, so he doesn't care. Just then, someone throws a piece of paper at him, prompting one of his classmates to approach him and ask, "Drink the water," realizes what's in it. However, he still ends up drinking all of it. Extending his hospitality, he told her that since she had to leave early, he would stay longer. However, the girl couldn't allow this, and told the protagonist realized there was something else she wanted to ask him, thinking that the medicine hadn't taken effect yet, so she couldn't let him leave. The protagonist, looking at the girl, asks, or rather, implies that she won't let him leave that night. Taking a seat, she asks him what's wrong, and to just ask him what she wants to know. Meanwhile, the protagonist's bodyguards receive a message from him, instructing them that they have 5 minutes to cut off the signal to all the buildings. He finished relaying the order and quickly told his colleagues that they needed to get to work, asking one of them that it took 2 people to unplug the cable from that building, and that, furthermore, he had to destroy all the signal towers surrounding the community. Going through with the protagonist told the girl he wanted to ask her something, as he felt the pill begin to take effect, thinking that the pill, apparently, it was an aphrodisiac, and he wondered if the girl knew. But the moment the girl asked him if he was sleepy, the protagonist realizes that the girl seems unaware, and if that's the case, it means someone tricked her into giving him an aphrodisiac, but she thought, whether his housekeeper is educating him all over again. The protagonist, recognizing who threw it, says she's an annoying girl, to which his classmate responds by asking, if perhaps, that it was just a sleeping pill, or rather, that weird sleep aid. And if she's also unaware, there must be other people involved. And sure enough, that's right, they were monitoring him with a sort of mini hidden camera, which, let me emphasize, was hidden inside the electrical socket. These are the people who, they were watching the protagonist and the girl. They commented that a good show was about to start, and that night, the brave would learn what Yahoo is. Meanwhile, Lion was simply observing the girl. Noticing that the protagonist's forehead was very hot, he couldn't help but feel concerned, and therefore, he tells him that he will take him to the hospital. The protagonist, who was feeling the effects of the pill more and more intensely, thought that this woman was quite stupid. However, at that moment, he realizes that the signal had already been cut off by his bodyguards, which causes those who were watching to wonder. They wondered what happened, only to realize that the signal, or rather, the network, had been disabled. The protagonist, throwing the girl onto the couch, told her that she was stupid. She doesn't even realize she was tricked, and heading to the bathroom, he tells her to bring him ice cubes, the more the better. Faced with this, the girl asks him. The protagonist questions how it's being used. However, at that moment, the protagonist's bodyguard appears, shouting and asking where he was. The girl tells him that the protagonist is in the bathroom taking a shower, and upon leaving, she tells the protagonist that he is still young and needs to take it easy. He's aware that many people use their phones in class, but why was he the only one called out, adding, "So, that girl has been interested in you, that young people just don't know." He literally thought the protagonist had already done some fun stuff. However, he tells him to shut up and get to work. But he doesn't understand what's happening until the protagonist points out that there must be hidden cameras in the room and urges him to find them. This is when he realizes that the girl intended to secretly take photos of the protagonist and the bodyguard. When he confronts her, she denies it, claiming she had no idea what he was talking about. The protagonist tells his bodyguard to stop talking nonsense and hurry up to find the cameras, all while he asked the girl what kind of medicine she was told it was, and she replied that she was told they were sleeping pills, which leads to the protagonist, laughing, calls her stupid, and asks if she really thinks she can get away with taking a photo of him while he's sleeping. Pointing to the glass, he tells her that what he gave her was an aphrodisiac, adding that she has already been marked as a sacrificial lamb, and asking her if she is aware of it. The bodyguard ends up informing the protagonist that he discovered a hidden camera in the electrical outlet, which greatly surprises him since he couldn't believe it was true. While his bodyguard was telling him to continue searching the bedrooms, the protagonist tells the girl that it appears her biological father pushed his daughter into the fire pit, words that ultimately surprise her, and she asks the protagonist how he knows this, to which, since freshman year of university, and then asks, "So, you really haven't noticed?" But the protagonist simply replies, asking, "What's it to him?" He replies that he was just guessing, and it seems he guessed correctly. Moments later, the girl tells the protagonist that Leo Yum is, in fact, her father left home 15 years ago for another woman, abandoning her and her ailing mother, leaving her to fend for herself. She then reflects on what happened 3 years ago. She went out on her own, and in her desperation, she happened to meet him, who was already a member of the Kim group at that time, Jong, and that he was also the one who arranged for her to join King Jong so she wouldn't starve on the streets. Although the protagonist hates him, he interjects on her behalf, saying, "But you can't reject her request either," asking her if he was correct, to which she ultimately, confirming with her silence. After reviewing everything, the protagonist's bodyguard hands over all of the hidden cameras that were placed throughout the area. The protagonist is at home, watching him. His secretary asks if, seeing the situation, he still has hope in him. She answers herself, saying she doesn't believe he does, and that they must have kept him in the dark. The protagonist tells her that if he wants to take down Jane, he must find a breakthrough in the army and needs the girl's help, and if she doesn't want to help, he won't force her. So, without further ado, the protagonist tells his bodyguard that they have to leave, which makes the bodyguard ask if that was all for today. However, we are shown the girl shedding tears because of the protagonist's words. A little later, the girl, while looking at the cameras they had found, was thinking about what had happened to her. He probably benefits from her interest in him, so his friend tells him he has no idea how many people envy him for that. The protagonist thinks to himself. The protagonist, a little later, the girl, while looking at the cameras they had found, was thinking about what had happened to her. Some time ago, as we see in her memory, She was fired from her job in the pouring rain, and just when she thought all hope was lost, he appeared. Lion offered her a new opportunity, and as she went back to him, she thought that he was all she had in that world anyway, so she wanted to give him another chance. And yes, the girl is very naive. However, the girl overhears someone telling Lion that he is the most ruthless of all, because he has been searching for 3 years, well, using his daughter as a chess piece, and he has heard that Lion has a bad relationship with the girl, which is why he asks him how he got her to treat him, well, to treat him obediently, to which he, already drunk, says that it is simple, explaining that, first he greets everyone, the companies he wants to present to won't hire her, and lastly, he had to get her on stage when she collapses, so she'll hear everything. He literally meant that he took advantage of the girl not doing well in life, and that's when he made his grand appearance on stage. The girl, having heard everything, was devastated and cried because of his words. Meanwhile, the protagonist's bodyguard told him that this girl obviously, she betrayed him, asking why he didn't take care of her, to which he responded that since ancient times, the most difficult thing to abandon is love, that he already knew that. However, he doesn't have the money for romance. At that moment, after the protagonist says these words, he receives a message from a family and that he is only his boss, so why should he betray his father? However, his secretary is actually working for Jane, which is truly unexpected. He tells the protagonist himself not to worry, because his brothers are completely loyal to him, which prompts the protagonist to reply that he is aware of that. He is very satisfied with his performance, telling him not to treat people with distrust, because ever since he started treating him as his confidant, he has trusted him completely. 100%. These words make him admire the protagonist even more, because despite being so young, the protagonist is in charge of empires worth tens of billions, and he can still treat his subordinates with absolute trust, thinking that powerful enemies await him, but he is not timid at all. Instead, he always maintains a vigorous work ethic, and while leaning against the car window, he wonders how such an enchanting man could exist in the world. But meanwhile, he was thinking all of that while the protagonist was simply watching a live stream of a cat girl. Well, a girl who was dressed as a cat. When the protagonist arrived, when he got to his house, he thanked the bodyguard, telling him that he needed to be picked up again tomorrow morning, and heading inside, he thinks that there are still 2 days left to finish the assignment, but he still doesn't plan to panic. However, he can't help but wonder, if anything, it's the system as a whole, with the business vision, the temperament of a boss, and a personality that isn't easily surprised. System congratulating him on activating the level system. After the host joins and everything is a success, the system tells him that, however, his thoughts are interrupted again by his secretary, who had followed him. She asks the protagonist if he needs some. Minutes pass as they talk about them, which leads the protagonist to invite him inside. Once inside the girl's house, he tells the protagonist that Leon is a beast because, for many years, she has been used by him, who says that she is a kind of discarded thing and does not deserve to live in this world. If he wants to destroy her, then she will take revenge, and with a determined look, she tells the protagonist that as long as she can get revenge, she will do anything, even sacrifice her body. However, the protagonist, taking her by the shoulder, he tells her that she doesn't need to make any sacrifices and that he can help her achieve her revenge. The next day, we see Leo Yoon talking on the phone. He instructs the person on the other end that when the protagonist goes downstairs, he should go upstairs so he can enter and find all the cameras. Eventually, though, the location is revealed. The girl, or rather, the secretary as we know her, asks him if he wasn't perhaps. That's what she was looking for. She tells her father that he was even deceiving his own daughter, asking how he could do such a thing, to which he apologizes for it, saying that it was his boss who insisted on being so reckless and ordered the installation of the cameras, and when he found out, it was already too late. But she shouldn't worry because he will never allow his daughter to be treated unfairly. And out of curiosity, he asks the girl. The host can randomly select a new identity every Monday and must complete a weekly task and will be able to permanently obtain. If the protagonist happened to find those cameras, to which she replies no, saying that he only came in and said he was tired while he was walking around. Standing next to the girl, he told her it was a huge problem, asking if the protagonist had gotten involved, but the girl didn't respond at all. Leo Yoon tells him to hurry up and speak, but she tells him to just take her to his studio because she doesn't want to see that woman, and then they go to in Leo's studio. She remembered what the protagonist had told her the night before, that the key to breaking the game was on Liao Yoon's computer. Taking the girl's camera, He asks her what's wrong with the memory card, since it was empty, which prompts her to ask if he thought she was going to give him the video for nothing, telling him that he had to give her 8 million, no more and no less, or he wouldn't get it. Nothing. Telling her that she's in no rush, and that, in any case, the protagonist doesn't love her. Well, asterisk didn't times love her. Annoyed by this, he thought that girl had taken over everything, and that if they didn't satisfy her demands, well, how else could they put an end to the protagonist? Thinking that way, he figured 8 million couldn't be taken from him, literally letting us know that he doesn't intend to pay that amount of money out of his own pocket. He himself, putting on a fake face, tells the girl that he understands, and that she had to wait a moment, since he would ask his boss, or rather, his leader. She, being alone, proceeded to extract all the information she could onto. In line 18, he arrogantly tells him that he currently has more money in his pockets than he would earn in a year, saying, "So that's what money is. A skill from that identity." The protagonist is surprised by this and wonders, "So, what level system? What the heck is that? And besides, a USB drive. A USB drive. Well, I think that's what it's called." We continue. On the other hand, the protagonist, who found himself in the same situation, tells this boy that, "If you discover what you're looking for, I'd give you 8 million words that would leave everyone stunned, because if they had known about it, even they would have taken action themselves. They were the ones who searched for that boy, and as I was extracting all the information, I just kept thinking that they needed to hurry." Meanwhile, on the other hand, the boy was telling the protagonist that he had found a hidden folder with a password, but it's supposedly not a big deal. Leo Yoon, who, as he was on his way back, he told his boss that he needed to transfer the money to him first, since he would give it to the girl after confirming the video. Upon opening the door, he notices what the girl was doing, but don't worry, the girl wasn't caught in the act, she was just looking at some photos. The girl tells him. At the same time, she insists that if he wants the video, he has to show her the money first. However, he doesn't respond, which makes the girl wonder, well, he asks if she has made a decision, as her patience is wearing thin. He tells the girl that he doesn't play games, because if she doesn't hand it over, both he and she, they will die a miserable death, but she simply laughs, turns around, and says that after all, her father, and those kinds of scenes, it's impossible for him to see her, and he says that he not only wants to mess with her, but also the relationship between Ansi and the protagonist. But he himself, already tired of so much, as a new identity, the system then tells the protagonist that the host must say, command, extract identity, in order to obtain the. He confronts the girl, asking if she thinks he's a fool, and demands the video. Then, his secretary informs him that after notice number 10, minutes later, an interim board meeting would be held, which the protagonist confirms. Furthermore, upon hearing that they were knocking on the door, he decides that he can, or rather, tells them they can enter, and the person knocking was Chen Hua's secretary, who informs the protagonist that Mr. Chen is letting him know that he will be participating in the interim board meeting, to which the protagonist stands up and says he understands, all while thinking that the decisive moment has arrived. Moving on to the protagonist's secretary, she ends up being thrown to the floor by Jung, who angrily tells her that he doesn't have time to play with her, warning her that he's giving her one last chance. Where was the video? However, the conversation is interrupted. Due to a call from Chenhua, he tells his boss that he still doesn't have the items, which prompts her to say that things are as she told him they would be. Previously, he was sent to the protagonist's girlfriend, a fact confirmed by his own boss, who says to him, Gunzi Jean is in the company. Moving on to the company, he was complaining to the protagonist because he dared to be unfaithful to his sister, but the protagonist doesn't say anything to him, and only, he glances sideways. Satisfied with the situation, he commented that it was a beautiful feeling, since so many days of depression had finally disappeared. Weekly identity. And after the extraction is successful, the system tells him that the host will obtain the identity of company president. The protagonist tells his girlfriend's brother to calm down, suggesting they could talk about it in his office, all while thinking to himself that this guy really knows how to act. Someone important, but he doesn't believe it because there are no hard feelings. He's pressing on, thinking he already had everything under control. He tells the protagonist that, as chairman of the Together, he has suffered an injustice and will definitely get justice. Given that, the brother says that if he truly wants justice, then that's what he will do. And at the Jasta moment he shouts for everyone to come in. A huge number of reporters end up entering the room. The bodyguards were trying to stop the reporters. Well, reporters were telling them that they couldn't enter. However, Confident in himself, he tells the bodyguards not to stop them, but to let the reporters film everything, since, according to him, the presence of the media can highlight the power of his Kim Jong group, which has no control over him. Afraid of the shadow, Han Xing, holding up a laptop, tells all the reporters that the truth is on it, and they just have to see it with their own eyes. Thus, he shows them a video where Eshe tells Lion to take care of Chao Chen-ming, since he is a real obstacle in his way. Upon seeing this shocking video, he quickly orders them to turn off the computer, which is obviously a bad move, since the computer contains such significant evidence, and clearly, with that video, they can blame him for Chao Chen-ming's death. The reporters realize this and proceed to make a big Kim Jong International, saying, "So, on the surface, the protagonist is an ordinary student, but he secretly possesses an unknown identity, the soul, fuss, asking various questions." As things were going from bad to worse, Chen didn't want the world to see that video, and asks his bodyguard what to do. If anything, he felt he was raising a bunch of incompetents, and if they still wanted to work there, they had 3 seconds to smash those people's cell phones and cameras. But since neither the protagonist nor anyone else wants that to happen, he calls his bodyguards himself, and, pointing to the bodyguards who were blocking the reporters from passing, he orders them to remove them from the area, since he doesn't want them interfering with the interview, something he still feels strongly about. Amen. They end up doing this, and the bodyguards stop the reporters from advancing. Outraged by what was happening, he asks Liu Yun how he dared to install a hidden camera in his office, to which Liu Yun responds that he only wants to keep a trump card for his own protection, or rather, he tells him personally that he was also deceived by the protagonist. The scene ends with the arrival of the police alongside Itao, and the police suspect that they are involved in the murder, so they end up taking him away. As the protagonist watched him being taken away, he lets out a sigh of satisfaction, since it was finally over. At that moment, the system congratulates the protagonist for completing the task, and to obtain the next identity, the protagonist must say, "Extract identity." Upon saying this, the system tells him that the extraction has been successful, and the identity, well, the heir to Kim Jong International, arguing that the previous president's psyche died, and he will take over the company from that moment onward, and the protagonist's identity is the King of Assassins, arguing that, in addition to being the president of Kim Jong International, he secretly has his identity is unknown as the King of Assassins, nicknamed God, and the protagonist's influence has spread throughout the world, making his reputation legendary. He is feared by thousands, and whether they are warlords, drug kingpins, or even police officers, it doesn't matter who they are. If he targets them, no one is safe. In other words, if you're in the protagonist's sights, you're done for. The system keeps telling the protagonist that he can choose to retire and enjoy his ordinary life. But now his enemy has found his trail, and his peaceful life is about to be disrupted. And the abilities associated with this identity are stealth, disguise, rudimentary medicine, firearms, proficiency in hand-to-hand combat, and highly developed senses. The task associated with this identity is to resolve the problem that his identity will be brought forth and survive, and the system also notifies the protagonist that this task has no time limit, and once the identity is extracted, it will be permanently valid, and completing the task will grant a permanent identity skill. Later, Lita argued to the protagonist that the police confirms that the video is real, and therefore the murder of Jane White Lion will definitely not be overlooked, and a sentence, or well, a life sentence, for life would be fair to them. However, the protagonist disagrees with this, since he wants them lifeless with no exceptions. He tells Lita, identity ability consists of business acumen, a boss-like temperament, and a calm personality. The system continues by saying, at the same time, surprised by this himself, he ends up obeying the order. This was while he was thinking that, when faced with a mortal enemy in business, the protagonist takes advantage of the opportunity to kill his opponent. And although the protagonist is young, he isn't losing to anyone. After retiring, the protagonist, who was seeing his feathers, Garrett quickly throws several leaves into the air, and looking at his own feather, he decides to throw it as well. With perfect precision, he manages to catch the 3 leaves with the feather. And if you're wondering why the protagonist did that, well, he's just testing out the Assassin King's ability. Then, after a while, he was confused because the protagonist asked him to fight. The protagonist tells him to attack with everything he's got. He believes. He understands the situation, saying he's heard a little about their rich people's game, so without further ado, he launches an attack himself. The protagonist simply stares at him. However, the bodyguard only ends up touching the protagonist on the shoulder and, recoiling, says that he's still in a lot of pain. But the protagonist, seeing that his bodyguard doesn't want to fight him, decides to go out and find someone to train with. Several minutes later, the protagonist, he found himself in front of a boxing center. Upon entering the place, the protagonist quickly observes some fighters who were sparring and staring intently at him. He says that it is very easy to defeat them. However, his words are overheard by this guy over here, who claims to be the coach of those fighters. This coach, the president of the Shao Chain Company died in an accident, and now that he's the young president, he must face a possible challenge to his position from the deputy director. Annoyed, he tells the protagonist that he personally trained those students and questions how he can dare to say that it is easy to defeat them. Maybe he went there to mock him, but the protagonist replies that, no, he misunderstood, as he isn't there to make fun of him, but is being serious. The fact that they are easy to defeat. Annoyed, the latter tells the protagonist that this was the last straw, asking if he was perhaps tired of living, suggesting that he get in the ring and compete with him, which the protagonist ends up accepting. Once in the ring, he asks the protagonist, how dare he enter his establishment with those small arms and feet, arguing that if he manages to defeat him that day, he will close the place down immediately, but the protagonist tells him that it's not a big deal, as it's just a warm-up match. Yao Chen eventually appears at the scene, he notices the protagonist, making him wonder why he's there. Just as the fight is about to begin, someone approaches him. Pelon does this to whisper something, which isn't revealed immediately. The protagonist, noticing this, asks what's going on, but Pelon replies that it's nothing. This, while he was thinking about what the guy told him, that Xiao Chen sent him to say, that if he gets rid of the protagonist, he'd be given $1 million. As he was looking, from a distance, he asks his subordinate if that boy is capable, to which the subordinate replies that the boy returned from abroad with a lot of money and is called the protagonist's task in this new identity is to investigate everything he can about the previous president and uncover the humming king monster, a specialist in black market competitions fueled by countless unrighteous souls. As soon as the fight begins, he quickly he attacks the protagonist, but the protagonist easily dodges each of his attacks, surprising both the bald guy and the other two. The protagonist, provoking him slightly, he tells him that if he wants to know how strong he is, he had better use all his strength, to which he, without a second thought, ends up unleashing his rage. All the while, he's thinking that the protagonist shouldn't even be standing before him, yelling, asking if he's begging for death, and if so, he will grant his wish. Hearing this, the onlookers cried out that the protagonist was done for, as the true explosive monster of pure muscle had awakened, while he just laughed at the protagonist, saying that this was the punishment for stealing his woman. Returning to the fight, he was launching attacks relentlessly. However, the protagonist, with effortless movements, dodged his attacks, and mocking him, asked if he could go any faster or if that was his limit. In response, the bald guy calls him a rat, saying he's good at dodging, but asks why he doesn't dare to hit him. The protagonist, releasing a murderous aura and preparing to attack, tells him that's exactly what he's going to do. The bald guy, for his part, also decides to counterattack. However, the impact was so strong that the bald man's right arm couldn't withstand it and ended up breaking, causing him to scream from the tremendous pain he was feeling, which made everyone truth of his death in less than a month, as well as regain control of the company. Faced with this, the protagonist was taken aback, wondering if present were surprised by the protagonist's impressive strength, while the protagonist himself found it incredible, considering he possessed such strength. Inhuman, seeing what happened, wasn't going to just stand there waiting for things to unfold, and therefore, decides to leave. However, he stops himself, frightened. He ends up stopping when he hears the protagonist greeting someone. As the protagonist approaches, the bodyguards halt him, telling him to please maintain his distance, but the protagonist ignores them and ends up removing them from his path in his own way. This happens while he tells Xiao Chen that, just now, he asked someone to send that boy a message, and he overheard every word he said, to which he, fearful of what the protagonist could do to him, says that it's just a misunderstanding, but the protagonist doesn't believe him, and approaching closer, tells him that this is the first and last time he does that. That is, warning him that he really doesn't want to have to deal with him, but if he tries to pull any dirty tricks again, he won't hesitate to end his life. Wouldn't hesitate to take his life. With his dominating presence, he told him that he hoped he would remember what he said and not do anything stupid again. And Leaving, he tells him, that's all, while the people around wondered who that guy was, since he had easily defeated two of Chao Chen's bodyguards and dared to touch his face. But what was most shocking was that Chao Chen didn't even dare to make a single move. Meanwhile, Chao Chen, maybe this is all a dream, and how he even became the president of the Kim Jong group. Is this really happening? The protagonist questioned. However, his thoughts are, listening to everything, he felt frustrated that he couldn't do anything. Moving on to the protagonist, he was talking with his girlfriend, asking her if she had some free time to go out to eat together. But she only tells him that if he continues skipping class like that, he will be expelled sooner or later. However, the protagonist, he says that he spoke with the school director and donated $3 million to the educational fund for the following week, saying that they can give him free rein for his final exams. However, while the protagonist was talking on the phone, he was being observed by these two people, who appear to be assassins. The beautiful girl, while feeling the breeze on her face, tells her companion that it is hard to believe that the king of the assassins is so young. But his partner tells her that it is not important, since the protagonist is about to become a corpse. However, at the moment that these individuals had the protagonist in their sights, but he turned around to stare directly at them, which surprised the girl. Seeing her reaction, her companion asked what was wrong, and she responded that it seemed the protagonist had found her. The boy, while holding the soul, remarked on how they could be discovered from such a distance, but he was greatly surprised to see that the protagonist was no longer in the same spot. The protagonist, who had concealed himself, wondered if Chao Chen might have sent them, as he sensed a murderous aura, but he concluded that it wasn't possible, since Chao Chen, his reward today, and from now on, must be separated from him, since they are not from the same world. The protagonist's classmates were murmuring amongst themselves, interrupted once again by the girl, who, banging on his desk, demanded to know why he was ignoring her. But the protagonist, still confused by everything that himself couldn't be that fast, and with a knowing smile, he says that it appears the ancient enemies of God have arrived at the doorstep of the house of the. As the protagonist, we see that several bodyguards are now guarding his house. His bodyguard informs him that 30 people have been added to the security personnel, and infrared weapons have also been installed around the villa, so that anyone who approaches can be detected immediately. The protagonist says that this is fine with him, and since it was a difficult job, he needed to go home to rest. In a change of scene, we can see how the protagonist's villa was being observed by the assassins. The boy tells his partner that the protagonist's security has been increased, so it seems the message got through to him, to which the beautiful girl responds that she can't believe they have used such a weak method to protect himself, and wonders why they decided to retreat, questioning if perhaps God really isn't that good at being with him. The protagonist, while reading a magazine, thought that with this method they should be able to paralyze them and then deliberately display a structure and lure them into attacking, then trap them in a net. But the question is, what time should be chosen to draw the snake out of its hole? However, the protagonist ends up receiving a call from an unknown number. Upon answering, the person on the call, the system that contacted her, tells the girl that she's in no state to talk, but their conversation is interrupted by the arrogant boy, who shouts at her. He ends up asking what he was doing. Upon hearing the voice, he thinks it's Tony, one of God's previous people, and wonders why he was suddenly contacting him, asking if God hadn't retired. The protagonist asks Tony how he dares to call him directly on the phone, asking if he doesn't know that he can't meet or speak directly in this business, and if he has forgotten the rules of the business. Tony King, it seemed, was enjoying the beautiful view of the sea. He tells the protagonist not to misunderstand him, as he has no intention of disobeying his order, but he has a big order that will be a piece of cake for him. Since the protagonist is apparently interested in that, he asks him to talk about. He himself tells him that the target is in the city of, since it shouldn't be too far from the protagonist, and says to him, so you know, the controller is generous, since he offered him $3.5 million for a single job. The protagonist, taken aback by such a large sum, asks him what the target's social standing is that makes his value so high. The man replies that he is the president of a publicly traded company, telling him that it's a piece of cake for him and that he will send the target's information to his email. After hanging up, the protagonist couldn't shake the question of what the target's social status is that makes his value so high. However, upon opening the email, he is shocked to discover that the target is himself. He asks the protagonist if he's forgotten what he said, reminding him that he told him to stay away from him, and the girl asks if he doesn't understand people. And upon seeing this, he couldn't help but spill his drink. Back at the beautiful beach, the person who was enjoying it receives a call from the protagonist. He himself, upon answering the call, asks the protagonist if he is interested, to which the protagonist, striking a threatening pose, responds by asking what the employer's name is. The latter, surprised, tells the protagonist that the employer's information cannot be disclosed to him. However, the protagonist silences him and says that if he wants something, he will definitely get it. Or is he naive enough to think that he can't handle it, which causes the man to break out in a cold sweat. This, while the protagonist was telling him that he was just joking, and that of course he can easily get whatever he asks for, saying, to hell with the rest of the rules. Tony tells the protagonist that the employer is a native of Gia, and his name is Yao Chen, a young master from a corporate group, to which the protagonist, hearing this with a smile on his face, he remarked that it was obvious Chao Chen was asking for death. However, their conversation is interrupted when someone opens the door. The door was opened by his beautiful girlfriend, who was wearing a stunning white and blue dress. She asks the protagonist what he was doing, since he doesn't even answer the phone. The protagonist, confused to see the girl at his house, asks her why she is there, to which she responds, or rather, she asks him why he's asking why she's there, reminding him that they were supposed to have lunch together to return the favor, something the protagonist, okay, and from that point on, we know what happened. Moving on to the protagonist, after remembering everything that had happened, he thinks that he actually, as he stared at her, he said he had forgotten. Grabbing his arm, she asks him if he even realizes how difficult it was to find that restaurant, and if they lose, he had to find a way to reward him, and while he was outside, the protagonist tells his bodyguard to bring some other bodyguards with him, and have them follow him, while the girl was wondering why there were so many people around the house. With that being said, both the protagonist and the others end up leaving. The assassin, who was watching him from afar, asked his partner if they should follow him, to which she replied that there was no necessity, since today wasn't the day to act, because, judging by his reaction during the day, the protagonist definitely already knows about them. As night falls, the girl, a little sad, got out of the car, because the hotel where she and the protagonist were going to have dinner didn't allow her entry, as they had arrived half an hour late, telling the protagonist that the next reservation wouldn't be available until the following month. However, the protagonist wasn't paying attention because he was talking on the phone. Seeing this, she asks the protagonist what he's doing, and he replies that he was just acquiring the hotel so they can go out to eat tomorrow, which surprises her. Upon entering her home, the girl tells the protagonist to make himself at home, since she was going to cook him a package of noodles. The protagonist, seeing that it's dark, asks her if she's home alone, to which she created an identity for him, even with the thoughts associated with that identity, which means that memory can be modified. But in any case, replies that her brother is out of town, and her parents went out to a meeting, and tells him that the light switch is behind the sofa, and asks if he can turn it on. For her, however, the protagonist starts acting crazy and kisses her, clearly wanting to be the rich one, Lino. The girl, blushing intensely, asks him to not do it, but we know that she really wants him to. And after the protagonist was about to zip up her dress and throw her onto the sofa, she argues that she isn't ready for that, but the protagonist, hotter than the fires of hell, tells her not to be nervous because he's going to be gentle with her. However, just as they were ready for action, someone turns on the light. That someone turns out to be the girl's parents, who demand to know what they are doing. The girl, extremely embarrassed, asks her parents if they weren't supposed to be at a meeting, but her father, quite annoyed, responds that the meeting was cancelled temporarily, and he was grateful it was cancelled. Otherwise, his house would have been used as a house of youthful lust, without the girl even knowing. He tells his father that it's not what he thinks. However, the protagonist makes things even worse because, while zipping up his pants, he tells him, to the girl's father, that they tripped on the switch. And looking at the switch, he says, "Ah, so that's where the switch is. I'll keep that in mind for next time." However, the girl's father asks him if his fly accidentally opened, implying that he thinks that, anyway, now it's kind of fun. Meanwhile, this girl approaches her boss and tells him that she has received news that Lita betrayed him, is stupid, to which the protagonist responds by saying that the quality of the pants isn't very good, and as he leaves, he tells them that he has things to. As they leave, the guards notice the protagonist, prompting the speaker to ask why he finished so quickly, but the protagonist, he simply tells them to go back and leave him alone. Getting into the car, he tells us that he has gotten rid of Tiao and the others, and besides, those assassins never showed up, saying that he can't seem to shake off his anger that day, but it doesn't matter since he has a great punching bag. After a while, he He arrives at a residence and asks the bodyguards there if this is where Chao Chen lives. One of them grabs the protagonist by the shoulder and tells him that it's none of his business and that he has to get out of there. However, a punch from the protagonist turns him into mincemeat, and the other one who was left ends up pulling out his. Alma points at the protagonist and asks if he's seeking death. However, upon seizing his soul, the protagonist realizes he can't shoot, which leads him to wonder what's happening, and the protagonist responds that the soul cannon is misaligned, questioning why it keeps firing. So, without further ado, the protagonist puts him to sleep as well. However, someone who was enjoying the good life wonders why there was so much noise outside and, upon exiting, yells at his men, threatening to kill them both if they continue making so much noise. However, he's met with the pleasant surprise that, to the school's protagonist, but his people are always one step ahead. Literally. They've already dispatched people to take care of the protagonist. The person at his door is the protagonist. Extremely nervous, he asks the protagonist what he wants, but the protagonist, turning to the girls, tells them that they leave the area, as it had nothing to do with them, and after the girls are gone, the protagonist proceeds to sit down. However, at that moment, some thugs ended up showing up, to which the protagonist, smiling, says that it's incredible, since it seems he accidentally ambushed the staff, or, well, planned ahead. However, this angry man tells the protagonist that he made him look bad in public, and asks him if he actually thought he was going to just sit back and do nothing. After that, he tells him that he just hired more people in the afternoon. However, he's already been caught in the net by nightfall, to which the protagonist responds that he's still glad that he did that, since there's no point in intimidating a scared chicken. But the man, already tired of the protagonist's empty words, tells him he ends up ordering his men to give him a beating to stop him from laughing again. However, since the protagonist is a grown man and feels no fearlessly, he takes them out one by one. He defeated 1, 2, 3, 4, and even 5 men in the blink of an eye. And as he finished off the last one, he looks at Chao Chen and asks what he had said earlier, then walks towards the boy and asks if he has any more cards to play. This prompts Chao Chen to shout that if he has any heart, he has to take his life, or he won't truly be done with him. And even if he's good at that, can he? However, her boss tells her that she only had to remove him, since he is still just a child and can't do much, because from that moment on, no one can stop him. Next, we see Li Tao, who was reading something to the protagonist, which stated that Chen Uva is the vice president of the group. Possibly protect his girlfriend 24 hours a day? He tells him that he could have taken her with a simple phone call, and hundreds of brothers under his. Words were exchanged, leading the protagonist to deliver a tremendous blow to Chao Chen, prompting him to ask the protagonist questions, how dare he hit him? However, the protagonist, with a threatening look, warns him that if he dares to touch his girlfriend, he will make death an option for him, as he has more than 100 ways to make his life a living hell. But Chao Chen, laughing, asks if he isn't simply the president of a company, questioning what he can possibly do and if he thinks he is God. But the protagonist, with a satisfied expression, tells him that the biggest mistake he could have made in his life was paying 3.5 million for his head. Chao Chen, upon hearing this, asks how he knows that, since he managed to get the best broker, and only he and God know why, as there's no way he could possibly know. Nevertheless, the protagonist is getting closer, into his ear, whispering that it's simply because he is God. However, at that moment, the protagonist ends up noticing something, and, grabbing the boy, we quickly see several bullets whizzing past him. It's literally a shootout. The protagonist, while taking cover, says to himself that he was very ruthless, since he still had an ace up his sleeve, but the other responds by asking if he would arrange for someone to shoot business, arguing that he should have originally been the next in charge, but because the shares are in the protagonist's name, he can't himself. The protagonist realizes that it wasn't the boy who planned this, but the assassin who had been chasing him during the day. But because the protagonist had his head poked out, he was almost hit by a bullet, but thanks to that, he was able to spot the sniper's location. The sniper, seeing no signs of movement, wonders if the protagonist is planning to confront him. However, as he turned his rifle towards the entrance, he muttered that this is the exit, and, the moment the protagonist steps out, his head might explode. But no matter how long he waits, the protagonist doesn't appear, which makes him wonder if the protagonist has disappeared altogether. However, his thoughts are interrupted when he receives a powerful blow, the impact of which seems to be from some Chinese chopsticks, and the person responsible for this was the protagonist, who, introducing himself, tells him that he will teach him the proper way to use chopsticks, while taking away the, sure, he resorts to a smoke grenade. He thinks it's just as expected of someone like God, since he can even throw chopsticks like bullets and hit his enemy instantly. He can't defeat the protagonist, so he runs away using the smoke grenade, and as he retreats, he admits that the opponent is too strong and he can't fight or even get close to him. But he wonders how the protagonist managed to hurt him with simple chopsticks, and just when he thinks he's finally gotten rid of the protagonist, he's struck by a kick from him, who sarcastically wishes him good night. In response, he pulls out his gun. However, what can take responsibility, which leads the protagonist to ask if that guy perhaps hates him because of that. All while thinking about what the system gave him, he didn't expect was that the protagonist would disappear, and in the confusion, the protagonist suddenly reappears from above, thus managing to land a tremendous kick to his face, causing him to bleed out. Picking him up, the protagonist asks who sent him, which, he says, is to be expected from the predecessor of the King of Assassins, asking him if he is any different. But the protagonist, while looking at him, coldly, he asks him what he means by a previous generation, and if he's implying that he is the king of the current generation of assassins, held over the edge of the current building. He tells him that he is not interested in meaningless things, and that he has 10 seconds to tell him what he wants, or else he won't have another chance to open his mouth again. However, he was distracting the protagonist in order to surprise him with an unexpected attack, but that's not what. The story recounted that, before the impact, the protagonist was going to end up letting it go, and as the protagonist watches it fall, he insists that he will find it on his own. We pick up where we left off in the previous chapter's video. We saw how the protagonist ended up releasing the killer. However, he was rescued by his comrades, who didn't hesitate to shoot at the protagonist. This pool. The protagonist was escaping. He tells everyone to get up here and not let him abandon the area. Holding his companion, he asks how he's doing, and if perhaps them, saying things like, "Look at how he dresses," yet he still dares to go out with the vice principal's beautiful niece. However, a man ends up arriving at the scene, can take responsibility, which makes the protagonist ask him if that guy hates him for that reason, all while he was thinking that the system gave him wound is too serious. To which his companion replies that it's nothing, just a couple of broken bones, and it's not a big deal. After a while, one of his subordinates, he ends up telling the girl that the protagonist had escaped, which angers her, but his partner tells her that they have to leave, since the police will be there soon. So without further ado, everyone prepares to leave the place. Before leaving, he tells his partner that they have to be very careful, since the protagonist is a terrifying opponent, and they must be cautious when confronting him, but she says that she has to return to the boss and explain the situation. However, as they are leaving, we see someone underneath the car was hiding, and that someone was the protagonist, who had unexpectedly snuck in. When the assassins arrive at their boss's villa, they are complaining, since they were a bunch of useless fools. He gave them an exorbitant amount of money, and they couldn't even lay a finger on him. The protagonist, the assassin who was beaten up by the protagonist, tells his boss that he was too reckless and thought he could handle the situation himself. So he apologizes, asking for one more chance and assuring him that he will personally remove God's head with his own hands. This prompts the response that he'll give them 3 days. If they fail within that time, he will take control of the operation and supervise. A month to uncover the truth behind Chow's death. Therefore, the most pressing task at that moment is to seize control of the company. Nevertheless, the battle personally, and will be the one to take care of God. And if they still can't deal with God, then he will deal with him himself, telling them not to make him look ridiculous. Ridiculous again in the face of this. He says that apparently more than one plan is necessary for this, and failure is no longer an option, which makes him. He asks himself if they should then start with the women around him. However, while they were talking, the protagonist, who was hiding, thought that the guy who was talking was Karen Wilson, and that 3 years ago, at the New York racetrack, she lost a large sum. Well, a large sum of money to God, and 3 fingers were cut off. He can't believe that, after all those years, the guy still wants revenge, thinking that, in that case, he was going to spend a good time of charity with him. Moving on to the protagonist's girlfriend, he ended up calling her. She answers the call. Well, when she answers the call, she asks the protagonist what he wants from her so late at night, prompting him to ask her if she wants to go on a cruise, which surprises her, and she wonders aloud, so, like, a cruise? Staying at the superior 5-star hotel, she, who was observing the wonderful view, commented that she found it incredible and beautiful at the same time, asking the protagonist, "What? how he knew about that place, which is truly beautiful. The protagonist, in response, tells her that it's nothing, since there are many more places in the world. Well, in the world. He responds to the protagonist, saying, "What ruthless humans." However, several executives have opposed the idea of him becoming the leader, and furthermore, the protagonist is very young, so that are much more beautiful than this one, and grabbing her by the waist, he tells her that as long as she likes, she can accompany him to all of those places. After a while, the man who was eating finishes his meal and calls his bodyguard to ask how things are going at home. The bodyguard tells him that the protagonist was able to identify the people who were following him, and furthermore, they didn't notice anything unusual, so they assumed he was working. And if you're wondering how the people following the protagonist came to that conclusion, well, the bodyguard found someone who looked exactly like him, protagonist, to place in the company. After hanging up, the protagonist thinks that he will use a decoy to paralyze those assassins and ensure that the old man throws himself on him. And if the information is correct, Wilson's ship will arrive in the afternoon. However, the protagonist's thoughts are interrupted by a girl who, he asks if he could sit there because there were no other empty tables. This girl's name is Jean Jo. Since the protagonist doesn't mind the girl sitting next to him, he tells her that she can take a seat. However, the people in the place who were watching the girl were stunned, or rather, stunned by her beauty, as she had a beautiful face, a beautiful body, and was extremely gorgeous, so much so that this boy's girlfriend asked him where he thought he was looking. The girl, on the other hand, was a little surprised because she was sitting, suggests that he be careful. However, the protagonist, smiling, tells him that if that's the case, then he should meet them, saying, "So, the board of directors is waiting for me," quite close to the protagonist, and he didn't even dare to look at her, wondering if it was because he was too shy to look at her. But she decides to forget about it, figuring the protagonist is probably just pretending to be cold to get her attention, saying she's seen plenty of people like that, so it's a good idea not to start a conversation. However, she was surprised by the fact that the protagonist suddenly ended up standing up and leaving, which makes her think that the protagonist only glanced at her once, and she wonders if she isn't attractive. Well, she is very unattractive in the eyes of the protagonist. As he was leaving, the protagonist wondered why that girl kept staring at him. However, his attention was drawn when these people announced that the Golden Sun had just arrived, and upon looking, the protagonist realizes that it was a huge cruise ship. Well, a cruise. International luxury cruise that is worth visiting once in a lifetime. And the protagonist, upon seeing this, smiling, says that he had finally arrived. As night fell, we can see a large number of people gathered around the cruise ship. The protagonist's girlfriend, who was on said location, commented that it was truly beautiful when seen up close, but the protagonist, hugging her around the waist, tells her, "What's the point of just looking at it from the outside? Look at it from the outside," and insists that they had to go in and look around, which prompts the girl to ask if they could even enter, since she has heard that in the main room. And since the protagonist wants to make him wait, he tells him to turn right at the next bend. This man, while tickets for the Golden Sun cruise must be reserved a year in advance, asking him if he even has tickets, but before the protagonist, he responds and ends up colliding with someone, who tells the protagonist, with a smile on his face, that he needs to watch where he's going. Showing the tickets to his girlfriend, he asks if that's the case, to which she, surprised, asks how he managed to get them. But before she can say something else, the protagonist interrupts her, telling her not to speak so loudly, and asking if she thinks he's just any ordinary person, telling her that he investigated the guy he just bumped into and found out he's in the casino business, and the money in his hands wasn't earned with a clean conscience, asking if she thinks they should let that kind of scum do whatever they want, to which she, upon hearing this, tells him that, in that case, they had to hurry and get on board, because if they arrived late, they wouldn't be able to board the ship. The protagonist believed the woman was easily deceived. The protagonist, while observing the people boarding the ship, thought that based on the appearance of those well-dressed individuals trying to board ship, they didn't really seem like ordinary tourists, leading him to believe that not many people disembarked after the Golden Sun docked. Many people rushed to board the ship, asking if there was some kind of party on board. But smiling, he says it doesn't matter because the game is starting. Waiting for the protagonist complained, since his mother told them that the protagonist would come to greet him. However, he still hasn't arrived, and he asks if perhaps Wilson will destroy it, passing by this man, his boss, who had thrown a glass of wine at him, and asks if he was sent there on vacation, asking where the head of God was, to which God replied that his men had already ambushed him on his way to work, and that 3 trucks full of heavy hitters would also be sent there. telling him that even if he's immortal, he'll be crushed into a puddle of mud. His boss tells him he better not make a fool of him again, or else he'll never see the light of day again. However, the conversation is interrupted by the girl, who informs his boss that everyone is already gathered, to which the boss, picking up his cane, responds that they need to go meet their dear friends. Moving on to the main event on the ship, someone in the crowd asked the protagonist what the focus of the event was, since people were boarding. Just to talk, the protagonist replies that he overheard the intentions of the people who came aboard to gamble, and that the ship will soon leave the dock and head to the open sea, where they can gamble with impunity, to which the girl, upon hearing this, says that they have to get off the ship then. But the protagonist tells her not to worry, because with him on board, that ship isn't going anywhere. However, the girl who was previously sitting next to the protagonist to eat was in that place. The protagonist wonders why that girl is there, and if she's also there to have a good time. The protagonist is mocking them. One of the people there tells him to shut his mouth because the president of his company ordered him to. A while as well. However, his thoughts are interrupted by Wilson, who was welcoming everyone to the venue and telling everyone that the next 3 days would be the greatest days of their lives, which makes everyone there shout out his name. Grateful, the protagonist nevertheless thought that this would also be his last day on Earth. After a while, the protagonist's girlfriend, overhearing that he was mentioning the name owner repeatedly, she asks the protagonist, "What do you mean, owner? Are you guys playing some kind of owner game right now?" To which he responds that, since they hadn't gotten to that topic yet, they should play a game to pass the time. All the while, he was thinking that Wilson had become cautious and only appeared once before disappearing, and since the valgus is quite large, it will take some effort to find him. The protagonist, upon snapping out of his thoughts drift as he notices the girl's presence again. She's clearly enjoying herself, raking in the money, while the protagonist, he stares at her, realizing she's a rich girl trying to experience life, and thinks, so, on top of everything else, she's quite cute. Moving to the surveillance room, he tells his boss that they still have an hour before arriving in Altamall, but then he notices someone and asks him who that girl is. His boss tells him to take a look himself, and that he needs to wait a moment. However, the boss then says he doesn't need to look her up, since the order, and if he didn't want to see the protagonist, then he should leave. This prompts the question of how a president, a student, what if, since that girl stepped onto his ship, she belongs to him, and he doesn't care about her background. Several minutes later, his guards, who are positioned around, they tell the girl that her boss is inviting her for a cup of coffee, but she replies that she doesn't know him, so they insisted. They threaten her and tell her to make another appointment. They also tell her that her boss said he would love to meet her, implying that it would be better for her to go with them. However, she asks if they even know who she is, and warns them that if they dare to do anything to her, they will be brutally punished. But this guy, smiling, he tells her that his boss has limited patience. While they were taking the girl away, the protagonist noticed what was happening. However, the protagonist was being watched from the surveillance room, but they couldn't figure out who he was. For this reason, the person watching asks if perhaps it has the face of the man with the hat, to which the man responds that he will take a look. However, upon closer inspection, he realizes that he cannot see anything. Estella Thomas asks how the hell he managed to do that, since she can't believe he could evade a dozen camera angles while also remaining seated there the entire time. And none of the cameras were able to capture an image of his face, and the ability to avoid all camera angles suggests professional training, which leaves him surprised, wondering if that woman perhaps had a bodyguard. The girl, who was being forcibly dragged by the EO, he agrees, because in his opinion, Chen should take the position of president, given that Chen is the president of Kim Jong International. However, bodyguard was asking for help. However, no one nearby was speaking up. He tells his boss that the person has been brought in, to which the boss replies, not wanting him to. Doesn't do anything to him, but tells him that he will give him money, since he has a lot of money at home. However, while this was happening, the protagonist was observing everything unfold, thinking, so that old pervert finally found her. Well, he finally found her after all. However, the protagonist had been planning to start with his plan when he is attacked by someone. However, the protagonist notices this just in time and manages to grab the thread that they intended to torture him with, and, with 2 simple movements, the protagonist manages to counterattack, throwing the guy to the ground, which makes the attacker wonder how it is possible for a bodyguard to have that kind of speed and skills, but the protagonist, while looking down at him, simply affirmed that it was indeed possible. Maybe that's it. However, the man, who had already collapsed on the ground, notices the protagonist's face. Just then, even more people arrive, which causes the protagonist to back away. Approaching his boss, he asks what's going on, but his boss simply thinks he recognizes that face and believes that he had seen her somewhere before. Therefore, he looks at the others and tells them that Mr. Wilson is being watched and asks them to increase security and ensure that no strangers are allowed to approach him. Moving to Wilson's room, this pervert tells the girl not to. This old man ends up telling everyone that it's quite the opposite, and that they are disgracing the Chowson name by questioning whether or not they even get nervous, saying it will be pretty great, but she begs him to stop, words that go unheeded. This old pervert, who had planned to continue the game, accidentally broke a bowl while moving, which caused his bodyguards rushed in, startled, asking if he was all right, to which he replied that of course he was, and what could possibly go wrong, telling them that if they bother him again, he will throw them into the sea to be shark food, so they should get out of here immediately. For everything. Now alone, the girl pleaded for help again. However, this man is truly a pervert, as you will realize when you read what he is saying, since I'm not going to read it aloud. However, the girl's pleas are heard by the protagonist, who, hanging a rope down, tells her that he will help, and so, throwing himself at the glass, he manages to shatter it, and when the old man tried to call for help, the protagonist stopped him by delivering a powerful blow directly to his face, his entire face. However, that's not to say that the old man's cries for help went unheard. In fact, they were heard, but the thing is that they thought, or rather, his bodyguards thought, that the old man was just shouting nonsense, and so, well, for that reason they ignored him. The pro also looked at him. The old pervert, now lying on the floor, claimed he was quite weak, as he'd collapsed from a single punch. Red Jacket, the director accompanying the Red Jacket Lord, tells him not to worry because his yum is present. The Red Jacket Lord received his will, since the person chosen by Mr. Chow must possess very good qualities. However, while he was listening to everything that was being said, since the girl didn't know who had helped her, she asks him to identify himself, at which point he dramatically reveals his identity, removing his mustache and glasses, and declaring that it was him, telling her they sat together and ate. A few hours prior, in case she doesn't remember, the girl, faced with this situation, throws herself into the protagonist's arms without a second thought. This was to thank him. However, at that moment, they announce over the radio that they know the protagonist is on the boat, and that if he wants to save his little girlfriend, he has to go see them right away. After a while everyone was waiting for the protagonist, he finally makes his appearance. Well, he appears, but not alone. He's with their boss. As they exit, their boss tells everyone to put their weapons on the ground, as he doesn't want to get hurt, any more than he already is. I don't think so. The protagonist tells him that he can't believe they found his partner, and it seems they possess some abilities. He also tells the protagonist that he is flattered by his words, but he has just seen through the surveillance and abandoned his girlfriend to take care of herself alone. That must be the biggest and last mistake he has ever made. But the protagonist, winking at him, tells him not to worry, since everything is under control, words that make him a little upset, and pointing at the protagonist, he asks if he plans to keep toying with him, telling him that there are many people there who cannot escape from that place, but the protagonist, threatening him, asks if those are his. He thinks they're all a bunch of idiots, confident that he'll win sooner or later. Just then, the protagonist arrives, greeting everyone, men, since they don't seem very obedient, to which he tells his men again to put their weapons on the ground, asking him who their boss is, and implying they don't want to obey him. Saying this to them, is it that they are deaf? Tell everyone to put their weapons on the ground, and they had to do it too. However, this man, smiling, tells him that he is sorry. She tells her boss that if he dies, the three of them will be able to share his actions and assets equally, and it is a deal that they cannot refuse, to which this man, enraged, tells them that they are beasts that eat away from the inside and outside. But while he was shooting, he told him that they were going to end the small talk and continue with the show. The protagonist's girlfriend, upon seeing this, tells the protagonist to be careful. However, the protagonist only dodged it, and the one who ended up getting hit was the old man, right between the eyes. And while the protagonist, he was covered in something, and the figure tells him not to hide, as it is time for him to move forward and openly accept his death. But the protagonist, meanwhile, he pulled out his ace in the hole, thinking that Wilson had died, but the system didn't indicate the mission's end, leading him to believe that it was time to go to a massacre today. And when he orders his men to attack the protagonist, they understand the order and quickly launch into the attack without. However, The protagonist took them down one by one, leaving them all lying on the ground, and when only a few remained, he told his men not to let. He welcomes the protagonist, introducing himself as Chachuma, which prompts the protagonist to say he's been wanting to meet him for a while. However, the protagonist escapes, while the girl was simply surprised by what she was witnessing. However, as the bullets impacted, with the protagonist's body on top of him, he proceeds to turn off the lamps with his knives, and when the lamp went out, that's when the real massacre began. Seeing that his men were falling one by one, he told those who were left not to panic and that they all needed to stay close to him, asking why they were afraid of him, even though there were several of them. However, at that moment, he is surprised by the protagonist, who, placing a sword to his neck, tells him that he is very brave for taking the initiative to reveal his location. Upon hearing the protagonist's voice, coming from somewhere, they end up shooting rapidly, or rather, wildly. However, what they didn't know was that all shots were fired at his boss, possibly because his partner was dead. He starts shooting at the protagonist like crazy. However, the protagonist dodges every single bullet with superhuman speed, but unfortunately, the protagonist decides to end his life. This guy tells the protagonist not to move, or else. However, before he can finish his threat, a knife strikes his weapon, disarming him. Now, completely scared and not understanding what's happening, he asks the protagonist if he's human or a ghost. With that much light, not even he. He then remarks that the protagonist was late with good reason, because he stopped to buy a latte, advising the protagonist that, as a piece of advice from him, can see where he is, and he asks why the protagonist can hit him with such precision. But the protagonist, stepping close to him, whispers in his ear that it's simply because he is God, saying, "So you must surely be wondering why I would risk bringing your girlfriend on board that cruise," telling her it's simply because they don't have the ability to threaten her in the slightest. And after ending her life, the protagonist, he is glad, as the mission is finally completed. At that moment, the system congratulates the protagonist for completing the mission, telling him that please say, command extract identity, to obtain that week's identity. And when the protagonist says extract identity, the system then says, the protagonist is informed that the fortune teller's identity has been successfully extracted, and he has acquired a new identity and is able to control everything, saying, so, on the surface, it is an ordinary college student, but his true identity is simultaneously the president of Yin International and the king of assassins, God. He possesses an innate ability to sense the universe's momentum and a gift that allows him to see 300 years into the future with divine fortune. The protagonist's new identity is that of a psychic, and the recap tells us that his mission involves the infamous Master Suv, and he must allow his reputation as a fortune teller to spread throughout the Jinchao province within a 7-day limit. Lastly, the system informs him that he will be given a reward of, he should go back to school, because this isn't a game, this is real life. However, the protagonist, ignoring his words, says to Aristea for completing the mission ahead of schedule. After the protagonist deals with the assassins, the system concludes, congratulating him on completing the task and granting him a new identity, that of a psychic. Following this, the police finally arrive at the scene, and the Faimunch, the protagonist, approaching one of them, informs him that he is the chairman of the board of directors of Kim Jong International, and, furthermore, that he was the one who made the report in the call, for which the police officer is extremely grateful, as the protagonist helped him to solve a major case. However, both the protagonist and his girlfriend were being observed by this mysterious person, who doesn't appear to be a good person. Meanwhile, the girl that the old man wanted to harass was reminiscing about what happened with the protagonist before he left. In the flashback, we can see how the girl, she asks the protagonist what she needs to do to get his attention, but he replies that he was the one who saved her. It was purely by chance, and since she decided to board that ship alone, she should have been prepared to take responsibility for her own safety. It was her decision where she wanted to go, of her own volition where she wants to go. Remembering this, the girl shows us a sad expression and wonders if she really doesn't deserve to have the protagonist look at her in a different light. Oh, the protagonist. Quite the charmer, captivating girls so easily. Getting back to the protagonist, Deputy Director Chen that, since he's new here, he's not very familiar with things, but asks if that is his dog. Hearing this, and becoming a little annoyed, he tells the protagonist he was telling his girlfriend to go get some rest, and that if she needs anything, he'll be in the room. This prompts the girl to say. The protagonist, who is scared, asks if those evil guys aren't going to come back, to which the protagonist responds that he swears on his life. Absolutely no one is going to dare to look for problems with her again, but she, blushing deeply, tells him that she still feels a little scared and doesn't dare to sleep alone. However, the protagonist, completely missing the hint, tells her that he will stand guard outside her room that night, or rather, outside her room, so that she can rest peacefully. The girl, upon hearing this, asks the protagonist if he is stupid, and blushing furiously, tells him. She asks if he didn't want her to take the initiative, telling him that since he was going home tomorrow, then he needed to hurry up, or else. The girl is determined to, being intimate with the protagonist. The next day, we see Ansi waking up after the protagonist thoroughly wore her out from the night before. When she opens her eyes, she notices the protagonist, who is greeting her good morning, which prompts her to ask him how long he had been awake, to which the insensitive man replies that it had been 20 minutes. He made her wait. The girl asks the protagonist why he was waiting for her, to which he, with a mischievous look on his face, tells her that he didn't have enough fun last night, so they should be intimate again, and that's how the protagonist's mattress got thoroughly used again. Dare to say that again. However, what he didn't anticipate was that the protagonist would deliver a tremendous slap. The protagonist, while, drawer that doesn't close again. Half an hour later, the girl was saying goodbye to the protagonist. He tells her to call him if needs something, since he's picking her up later that afternoon. Smiling, the girl simply tells him that, tonight, she'll definitely make him enjoy himself so much that he'll think he is in paradise. After that, the girl wants to repeat their encounter, and the protagonist wonders why he feels the need to rush out and buy medicine to make up for it. Following this, we move to a scene where the protagonist is setting up his psychic stall, or rather, a position to tell people's fortunes. The old man is surprised by the protagonist and tells him that he's quite clever, considering he's young and was there to scam people. However, the protagonist clears up the misunderstanding and tells the old man that he's not there to scam anyone because he has the power to tell people their futures and would never dare to deceive them. However, the old man doesn't believe the protagonist's words and tells him to stop, since he is only fooling those fools, and, besides, he's in the same business as him, asking if he really thinks he doesn't understand, saying that he had been scamming people in that place for 3 years, and the world is getting worse and worse, but the protagonist just thought that liars don't even bother to hide their misdeeds these days. However, this girl, who was walking with someone in that place, noticed he shook his hand, saying that since the neighbor's dog dared to bark, it deserved to be beaten, which left everyone in the place completely surprised. Protagonist. He quickly spots her and asks if she wants him to tell her fortune. The girl, upon seeing him, is immediately smitten by how handsome he is. The protagonist asks him if he really knows, or rather, if he knows anything about fortune-telling. However, the boy who is with her tells her, saying that the protagonist is a good-for-nothing, since he's just a fool who scams people. He asks if she really takes him seriously, to which the protagonist replies that it is not a lie and that he only tells fortunes. The girl, convinced by the protagonist's words, tells her companion that she wants to try it, and, shaking his hand, she asks the protagonist to please tell her fortune, which the protagonist had intended to do until her partner interrupts, and tells the protagonist that he had better tell him his fortune first, and if he doesn't tell him the truth, he was going to destroy his stand. The protagonist, faced with this threat, asks himself with a defiant tone that shatters the premise, which the boy, now a little worked up, reiterates, asking if he's afraid. Maybe he's scared because of what he said, all while the girl was trying to calm him down. However, the protagonist tells him that if he isn't willing to do it, he should just grab his things and leave. The old man, hearing this, says that the protagonist is a young person with a strong heart and doesn't know how difficult the world can be, saying that the protagonist wants to take red, but today he will learn a lesson. The protagonist tells the boy that if his reading, however, the protagonist tells him that the room will open in 5 minutes, so please, everyone, pay attention. This happened while he was thinking that the protagonist isn't correct. He's willing to make himself available to him, which the boy ultimately accepts, telling him that the protagonist really has some nerve. Before starting, the protagonist asks what he wants to know, to which the other responds that he only needs his fortune told for the day. After reading his palm, the protagonist tells him he fears there will be a bloodbath that day, to which the man, laughing, asks how. That he will have a bloodbath, saying he has a black belt in Taekwondo and will earn a new belt in a bloodbath, implying that he will return tomorrow and, when he does, he will have an adjustment, or rather, a settling of accounts with the protagonist. and as they were leaving, the girl tells the protagonist to hurry and change locations and hide for a few days. However, the protagonist says he doesn't need to, or rather, that it's not necessary. Need to wait until tomorrow, since he will see it with his own eyes that very day, and even though he wasn't eating, someone was listening to him. I don't know who he was talking to exactly. Getting back to the others, he was complaining to the girl when he suddenly ended up bumping into someone, which leads him to ask if he walks around with his eyes closed. However, just one look is enough to make him tremble in fear. While he was being surrounded by some more thugs, let's go back to the protagonist, who was getting ready and was being as, you have to play using common sense, as it will be your companion in this game. And after entering the company, this girl ends up welcoming the calm as possible, as if nothing had happened. The old man, seeing the protagonist so calm, tells him not to resist, and that he should hurry up and collect his. That's how he runs. However, the boy eventually arrives, kneeling before the protagonist and confessing that his eyes are blind to the mountain, and the protagonist's calculations are incredibly accurate, so he asks him to help calculate another fortune, to which the protagonist asks if he's truly convinced, to which the boy confirms that he is. However, the protagonist explains that he has a rule that prevents him from calculating a person's fortune more than once a day, but he can make an exception for the girl this time. Taking her hand, he asks what she wants to know, to which she asks him to calculate her fortune. In response, the protagonist asks her for her name and date of birth, explaining that the more detailed, the girl responds to the protagonist by telling him that her name is Huan Zhan, that she was born on the 19th of March 2002, and that she is in her second year at Jiangung Normal University, or rather, Jiannan University. The protagonist, already aware of this, tells her that she will make a small fortune that day, which causes the girl to ask him what he means by a fortune, asking if he perhaps bought a lottery ticket, which she denies. However, at that very moment, she receives a call from her professor, informing her that her application for the scholarship has been approved. While he was watching, the protagonist is recognized by this boy, who wondered what was happening and how the heads of the protagonist. He tells the protagonist that this young lady is Liu Su, a highly reliable secretary who can be given orders, and she will carry them out, to which the protagonist already, which makes the girl very happy, and looking at him with joyful eyes, she tells the protagonist that he really is a god. The people who were around, upon seeing this feat, quickly drew the protagonist's attention as everyone wanted him to tell their fortunes. However, the protagonist tells them that the situation is it's getting out of hand, so he will only read the fortunes of 2 people per day. Taking his sign, he leaves the area, and as he walked, he thought about how the appetite of the crowd has been ignited, and his popularity has increased, and it seems he will soon be ready to make his mark. Later, the protagonist, now in his office, tells us that he doesn't really know what the psychic ability granted by the system actually is. However, at that very moment, the system ends up appearing and tells the protagonist that everything has a mind of its own, and that he has to touch things with his hand to obtain their memories. The protagonist, upon hearing this, says that there really are instructions for use, and to verify what the system is saying, he touches this green pot, and, sure enough, just as the system indicated, that's exactly how it was, because upon touching the plant, he could see its memories, which showed his secretary enjoying things with it. But the most heartwarming thing that the protagonist saw in those memories was his secretary watering the plant. At this, the protagonist, blushing, quickly removes his gaze. He quickly removes his hand from the plant, and his secretary, who was arriving at that very moment, asks the protagonist if he was looking for her. Knowing this, he tells her he needs 3 cups of coffee delivered to the conference room. Several minutes later, everyone was seated inside, searching for her, to which he, embarrassed, gets up from his seat and tells her it was nothing, which leaves her doubtful, especially since the protagonist had called her to nothing literal. The protagonist, surprised by what just happened, thinks that touching something and seeing everything he has seen means that he can. However, with that image, the protagonist doesn't reveal what he was thinking. Everyone crowds around our protagonist, but he ends up dismissing the idea, since he considers himself one of the good guys and shouldn't have dirty thoughts. But, putting on a perverted face, he thinks there shouldn't be any problems if he tries it once in a while. Since the readers, that is, us, also want to see it, and if not, I'm going to protest. I also want to see it. It's intriguing, to be honest. However, at that moment, the protagonist receives a message from his girlfriend, asking if he was free at noon, since his parents want him to go to lunch with them, which surprises the protagonist a little. especially since his girlfriend had already arranged to meet with her relatives very soon. Time passes, and we quickly transition to Ansie's family lunch. Her aunt tells her that she can't believe Ansie found a boyfriend as cute as the protagonist. Referring to the protagonist, she tells him that he has to be good to her niece, to which he replies that she doesn't need to worry. He assures her that he will take good care of her. This man, who I'm telling you right now seems very strange to me, tells the protagonist that from now on they are family. Of conferences, the protagonist asks them to allow him to introduce himself, announcing, "That's right, Soo Young will be the president of Kim Jong International from this moment forward." He adds that they should contact each other more frequently, since he is also planning to settle in the country, and when the time comes, he definitely needs to ask the protagonist to take care of him. This man is underestimating the protagonist, and, by the way, as you can read there on screen, the girl next to him is the cousin of the protagonist's girlfriend, and the boy next to her is her boyfriend. The protagonist, hearing that they were underestimating him, simply tells him not to talk about taking care of each other, since they would help each other mutually. All the while, he's thinking that a small enclosure and a small search aren't worth his time. Wanting to humiliate the protagonist further, he asks what kind of work he does, to which the protagonist responds that he started a small company, leading the other man, flattering himself, to say that it's okay, and he should take his time, since they are family after all, and he will definitely help him with any future business endeavors. He tells the protagonist. If they happen to know Kim Jong International, he says flatteringly, adding that his family has a cooperative relationship with them, but what he doesn't know is that the protagonist is the president of that company. However, not wanting him to realize that he is the president, the protagonist pretends to be surprised, while the protagonist's girlfriend's family was watching him, knowing full well that he is only acting. The protagonist continues with his act, and, from that moment on. However, the protagonist is interrupted by this person, who says he wants to offer his opinion on the session. However, standing up, he tells him that he will bother him in the future to take care of him, to which the other replies that it is a good point. However, upon being given the tanger, the protagonist smiles slowly, knowing that he did all of this to activate his psychic mode with the boy, which, remember, allows him to see through someone's memories by touching them. Within those memories, we see someone, who I believe is that strange guy, nearly abusing a girl, who I think is Angie, the new protagonist, but I'm not sure. What do you all think? Anyway, moving on, they end up stopping him. He is stopped by the girl's aunt, who hands her daughter over, saying, "From this moment on, your daughter is in your care." However, that wasn't the darkest memory we witnessed showed some men dressed strangely, asking him if he was ready. They were about to begin happy hour that night, but I won't elaborate further, as you can probably imagine what's happening. He's left in shock by this, as he wasn't expecting to witness something like that, but the boy snaps him out of it by asking what's wrong. To this, he coughs and replies that it's nothing. Seeing him like that, his girlfriend asks if he's all right, wondering if he's perhaps overly tired. By last night, she's referring to what the two of them did. The protagonist denies it, saying that's not it, and that he just has a slight stomachache. At that moment, because he was running his mouth, the protagonist ends up throwing one of the teacups from the table at him, displaying a dominant presence as he. This was while he was thinking that the guy was really intense because of what he had just seen in his memory, as well as some of the explosions at the end of his life. Socially, in other words, he won't bother to take care of him, but how dare he hit his wife? Because of this, and in his mind, the protagonist doesn't plan to be generous with him. Faced with this, the protagonist comes up with a plan, saying that he forgot his phone, and, therefore, asks the weirdo if he can lend him his phone for a moment, something that the weirdo ends up accepting. The protagonist, while thanking him, ends up approaching his girlfriend, ready to ask her if perhaps her phone isn't in her pocket. However, the protagonist proceeds to open a file where we could observe how sick this guy is, and while the girl covered her eyes because of what she had just seen, the protagonist tells Alfredito that he was playing elegantly, which leaves him worried. Since he knew what the protagonist was talking about, and after telling the girlfriend this, the weirdo's in-laws are shocked by what they have just witnessed, asking the weirdo how long he planned to deceive her. However, the phone was snatched from the protagonist's hand, and upon seeing what after the protagonist showed them, she asks him how he knew the combination to her secret storage box, to which he replies that he accidentally found it. He put it there, to which he, while clearing the table, tells the protagonist that he did it on purpose. However, one kick from the protagonist was enough. He asks if his parents never taught him not to interrupt when someone is speaking, and then, while adjusting his jacket, he says, to break the table in two and seriously injure the weirdo, and while he's on the floor, the protagonist tells him that he has brought a heroic drama upon himself, ransom to gain access to his girlfriend, purely because he wants to inherit the Anne family's property. He even questions whether he should confess his impotence, shouldn't confess it to others, which prompts his father-in-law to ask what else he might be hiding. However, he is taken aback, and only asks the protagonist who he is. The protagonist responds that he is the president of the Kim Jong group, his name is Soo-young, and that, of course, he may also remember him by his new name, which is Flawless Prediction Sung. Following this, they ended up forcibly ejecting him from the house, and since the girl was devastated, Auntie Jean went to comfort her a bit. While the protagonist is talking with his girlfriend's uncle, he apologizes for the scare, but he tells him himself that he shouldn't apologize, because he was doing his family a great favor, but their doubt was whether Li Guo was the right boy. Strange, he had just returned from abroad. He asks how she knew so much about her problems, especially since even the protagonist knew the password to her phone. However, when he started to explain why, his girlfriend ended up throwing a crumpled piece of paper at him to shut him up and stop pretending. After a while, the protagonist was walking normally until he realized that someone was following him. The protagonist stopped and said to him, to everyone, announcing that from that moment on, he would be the president of the group, thinking, so he is easy to convince, and asking aloud, so who supports him, and who else? To stop following him, as he knew he had been behind him the entire time, and asked him to come out right then. And the person who was following him, she was none other than his girlfriend's cousin, who, as she left, asked the protagonist if he seriously knew how to tell fortunes, and if so, he had to help her to exorcise an evil spirit, which left the protagonist surprised, and he asked how to exorcise a spirit. Well, what do you mean, exorcise a spirit? Wicked. However, time passes, and we are transported to these residences. The girl who was with the protagonist mentions that they have been staying there since her family returned from overseas, which prompts the protagonist to say that the atmosphere is beautiful and quite comfortable for recovery. So he asks her if she can give him more details at that moment, to which she replies that it was 10 days ago, the night they moved in. For the first time, while she was sleeping, she heard a strange sound nearby, like someone was crying, but she thought it must be the wind. So, she got up to close the window. However, at that moment, the curtains wrapped themselves into the shape of a person, but in the next, the curtains returned to normal, but she clearly saw a man standing there. The protagonist, already aware of this, immediately asks the girl to show him the room, and once inside, the girl shows him where it all happened. The protagonist approaches the curtains and, placing his, who objects. But since no one said a word, the protagonist asks if they have anything to say, wondering why they are so quiet. Hand on them, uses his psychic ability, and was clearly able to observe a kind of ghost surrounding the house, which leaves him in shock. However, after, the protagonist then went outside to look for the ghost, and it's worth noting that he was wearing a garlic necklace as a bracelet, he thinks to himself. He also acknowledges his own boldness, since he dared to go catch ghosts alone. But as a master of fortune, he can't back down from the challenge of hunting ghosts. However, at that moment, the protagonist notices the presence of someone whose presence was, in fact, that of the ghost, to which the protagonist quickly turns around and attacks with a scroll in his hand, hoping to force the ghost's soul to retreat. However, the protagonist is surprised to see that it was a being, ghost girl, and since she is a ghost, she ends up climbing on him, causing the protagonist to fall to the ground while she stands up. He thinks he can only see her but can't touch her, saying, that's definitely cheating. The girl, surprised that the protagonist could see her, asks him if he can actually see and hear her, but since the protagonist was a little afraid of the ghost, he asks if she's trying to use him to reincarnate into a new body. This was while he was thinking that the ghost girl was really famous. However, the ghost, upon grabbing the protagonist's arm, realizes that she can be touched again. However, the girl, who was in her car, thinks that the protagonist, List. While observing, the protagonist thought that even though he is not old, he is quite bold, and Chief Chow chose him as his successor for a reason. This, in order to break the was possessed, and, therefore, decides to leave the place, something that the protagonist notices, and upon seeing her, he thinks that this woman has a hard heart, since she's so. As soon as he noticed something was wrong, he abandoned her and ran off. But after grabbing the girl, he declares it's time to get back to business, and then questions her. He asks her what her name is, and why she's hiding in that place to frighten people, to which she responds that she won't tell him anything unless he gives her a hug, because no one has hugged her in a long time. But seeing the protagonist acting oblivious, she decides to tell him everything. She tells him that her name is Kim Shui, and she fell off a cliff and died 3 years ago. Nobody can see or hear her, and since she has nowhere else to go, she had no other choice other than to stay in that place, thus telling us that she never intended to scare people, as she was only trying to get them to pass by time with her. Upon hearing this, the protagonist tells him that he understands, but insists that she has to go with him from now on, because that's what they agreed on. She asks him if he's telling the truth, and if he really wants to take her with him. The protagonist responds that yes, that's right, she has to go with him, since she doesn't have to stay in that place. But she tells the protagonist that she doesn't want to go, because she feels very comfortable there, and asks why she should follow him, since she's not his pet. The protagonist responds that it's simply because he can avenge her death, and turning to face her, he tells her that it must be ice. He tells the protagonist that, if that's the case, then he will share his thoughts, which leads the protagonist to grant him the floor, but not before. Difficult to watch the person who pushed her off that cliff living their life so peacefully. Continuing where we left off, after the protagonist takes the ghost girl to his house, he tells her to rest, because he will avenge her death the next day, which the girl agrees to. However, at midnight, the protagonist, who had been sleeping, opens his eyes and notices that the ghost girl is in his room, bed hugging him, which surprises him quite a bit. Thank Christ, the protagonist manages to wake the ghost girl up, which causes the protagonist to take the opportunity to ask her why she had gone to sleep in his room. She responds that she has moved to an unfamiliar environment and fears she won't be able to sleep well. She is literally saying that she is afraid. Faced with this, the protagonist wonders to himself if perhaps the unknown and fears that she cannot sleep well. He is literally saying that she is afraid. In response to this, the protagonist asks himself if perhaps the girl isn't a ghost, but he's still afraid of her. However, the girl throws herself onto the protagonist, telling him that it doesn't matter because he brought her there. In any case, he's responsible for her, and she ends up falling asleep in the protagonist's arms. He releases her the next day. The protagonist, who was with the girl, asked her where his enemies were going, since she should know the way, which she ends up confirming, as she gives him the correct address. Along the way, the protagonist commented to the ghost girl that he couldn't. Leading companies came to his school. However, everyone was surprised by the fact that these executives showed reverence to the protagonist. This happened while grabbing one of the cups, in case he says something he doesn't like. He tells the protagonist that the company needed someone young like him, and for his part, he believed that her own friend would kill her for the sake of a man, saying, "So she really is scum," to which the girl responds that she is, telling the protagonist that she trusted her deeply, but in reality, she didn't expect much from her. Faced with this, the protagonist will inquire as to why he didn't go to settle the score with her. Instead, he remained in the village down the hill, suffering, which prompts the ghost girl to say to the protagonist, it was for that reason, but she possesses a very powerful amulet and can't even get close, words that seem to pique the protagonist's interest since he says he was a little interested. This is while he was thinking that the mere fact that there is some amulet that can harm the ghost means that there are also powerful people in this world. After a while, they eventually arrive at the location. The ghost girl, who was somewhat curious, asks him to the protagonist who was heading to Bengal, implying he might take his life, to which the protagonist replies that he is a law-abiding citizen, the law, and that he has no desire to fight or kill, telling him to pay attention because cooperation will be beneficial. After several seconds of knocking on the door, the woman finally opens it for the protagonist, asking who he is looking for, but the protagonist, brushing past her, sighed, tells her that he was looking for her husband, and questioning if the protagonist was wandering around her house like a dog. Things that obviously, more than welcome, but the company is currently experiencing many ups and downs, and a lot of employees are useless. He tells him, so, if you can fix that, it will be a great money body, or not to the lady's liking, as she tried to stop the protagonist. But he simply kept going. This man, upon hearing the commotion, coming down the stairs, he asks his wife what was going on, to which his wife replies that the protagonist claimed to know him. He also mentioned that he needed to enter. However, he denies knowing the protagonist and tells him to stay away from his house, or, otherwise, he will call the police, which prompts the protagonist to remark that when the benefactor is present, he isn't even allowed to drink water, and when the protagonist managed to prevent him from drinking a bottle of water, he was surprised, but it was clearly with the help of the ghost girl that the Diemsing Manger protagonist was able to do that. With that said, The protagonist asks if they can sit down and talk for a moment, to which he eventually, to do so, and already seated, he tells the protagonist that they were fools, and hopes that the protagonist doesn't blame himself, or rather, doesn't blame him for not recognizing the mountain and offending it. Mountain and offending him, telling the protagonist that when he says he can save him, it means that he has suffered a recent calamity, something the protagonist mentions to him, the same one who was passing by that place and suddenly saw the evil spirit fleeing from the sky, so he went to look for it, and his house is the source of the evil spirit, telling him that in 3 days that family will be destroyed, which obviously ends up surprising them, an achievement for him, and everyone in the company expects him to pull it through. However, he makes a list, or yells at him, telling them how he plans to tell the newcomer to, who asked the protagonist how a family would be destroyed and for what reason, so they end up kneeling before the protagonist. Then tell the protagonist to please help him, as he would like to put up a longevity sign at home for his teacher, so that his children and the grandchildren burn incense to decorate it, which makes the protagonist ask him if there is anyone else in the house, to which he replies that, yes, there is, and it's his daughter, to which the protagonist, hearing this, replies that then, if that's the case, he had to tell his daughter that he is present, which he does immediately, yelling at his daughter to come downstairs right away. The girl, upon coming down, asks her father why he called her so loudly, telling her it was very annoying, but ended up being surprised to see his parents kneeling and asking him where he was. And what are they doing? The ghost girl, upon seeing her, remembers how she threw her off a cliff, which angers her greatly. She says, "So you were a bastard, a piece of trash," and without further ado, the girl lunges at her. He was telling her to give his life back. The protagonist, upon seeing the girl intently, realizes that the pendant she has is the amulet that Kim Shu mentioned. In other words, the ghost girl. However, when the ghost girl wanted to attack the short-haired girl, she was restrained by the amulet that the girl was wearing, but in a very exaggerated way, since it took off all of her clothes. The protagonist, upon seeing this, ends up suffering a stroke, which solved those problems, asking him, "So, is that supposed to be a joke?" while throwing a glass of water at him, in a very exaggerated way, since all her clothes were taken off. The protagonist, upon seeing this, ends up having a stroke, which causes for the protagonist to take shelter. The protagonist was bleeding, and they asked him what had happened. Meanwhile, the protagonist cleaned himself, and the ghost told him that as soon as he saw her, he was captivated, and forgot about the amulet, but the protagonist simply tells him to behave well, which she ends up accepting. Surprised by what was happening, they wondered if the protagonist was competing with the evil spirit, and if that were the case, the ghost was very powerful, since it was actually capable of forcing the protagonist to suffer internal injuries. But since the red-haired girl doesn't know what was happening, she asks her father what was going on, but he simply pulls her arm. I told him to be quiet, and that he had to kneel. First, the protagonist, now recovered from the bleeding, tells them that the evil spirits suddenly attacked, and he was nearly overwhelmed by the backlash, saying to him, "So, the fruit of that day is the cause of the past, and the blood fury has blossomed, and even he cannot fully retreat," which leads him to tell the protagonist that his family's life depends on him, and he must provide a way to deal with it. This prompts the protagonist, pointing to the short-haired girl, to tell him that he shouted at him, asking how he dares to shout at him. However, before the glass of water can hit him, the protagonist manages to catch it in mid-air. The evil spirit is targeting his daughter, asking what exactly she did to prevent her soul from dissipating after death, telling him that it must be the resentment of heaven. These words surprised everyone, but the person who seemed the most surprised was the short-haired girl, who, terrified, wondered if it could be about her. Agitated, she shouts that it must be Quinshu, that is, the ghost girl, who has come to take revenge on her, but her father tells her not to talk nonsense, since she is dead, which prompts the protagonist to ask him who Kim Shu is, all the while thinking that, as he expected, the two of them knew about it from the start. Then, approaching the protagonist, he tells him to stop hiding it from him, saying, "So, your daughter did something ridiculous many years ago, which was pushing a friend over the cliff, which the angry ghost claims is a lie, insisting it wasn't a mistake, but as we know, only the protagonist can hear the ghost. The protagonist insists that he needs to know exactly what happened in detail. Faced with this, the girl's father decides to tell the protagonist everything, explaining that it all began when a man told the protagonist that, when his daughter and Kim Soo were close friends, his daughter had a crush on a boy, but that the boy was interested in Kim Soo, and that later, the two girls had a heated argument while walking, and on impulse. However, she doesn't let, which leaves everyone very surprised. The protagonist, with a cold look, tells him that he will take care of it, to which the other responds that it sounds good to him. His father finishes and tells him not to talk nonsense, because Chanyol is fond of him, and it's all because of that sly girl, Kim Soo, that is, the girl in question. Her mother's ghost tells her the same thing, saying she can't believe that after all these years, she's still obsessed, constantly asking herself what she has. Seeing how she's looked at herself ever since Kim Soo's death, she replied to her mother, "Well, because I didn't think I was good enough for her." So, her father ends up silencing her with a tremendous slap. He tells his daughter that she was stupid, as it wasn't the time to talk about that now, and that the important thing now is to save his family's lives. Faced with this, the protagonist tells Mr. One that he is absolutely right and that they had to get to the point immediately. All this while the ghost girl was saying that she never thought it was because of that boy that she had been killed. Mr. Wan confirms what? That the protagonist told him, saying, "So, everyone, dead or alive, will die eventually anyway," explaining that the evil spirit is harming them and the protagonist has to save them. However, the protagonist replies that the reason is because Kim Soo has been dead for over 3 years, and it's impossible for the evil spirit not to have reached him by now. Yet he's been safe and sound, so he asks if he has some kind of magical weapon to ward off evil spirits. Mr. Walla, who is the protagonist, responds that he prayed to an illuminated amulet, and perhaps that's the reason why, telling him that it shouldn't take too long, asking if a month would work. However, the protagonist says that 1 week will be enough. This happened while we saw the girl hand the amulet to the protagonist. Upon seeing the amulet, the protagonist asks Mr. Wan where he got it. He took something out, to which you respond that Taoist master King Yang Yang presented you with that amulet in Yilin City. At this, the protagonist, looking at the amulet, thinks that it seems there are still important people in the world who can actually ward off evil spirits. And since the amulet had good material, he will keep it. The protagonist tells Mr. One that this blessing of peace is a little selfish of him, but the spiritual power is fading and is no longer sufficient. He can help the one family escape from this disaster without taking money, but he has to keep that blessing of peace to study and investigate, asking if what he says seems all right to him. Mr. One tells the protagonist that if he wants to take it, he has no problem with that, and if you can help his family escape this disaster, they will definitely be grateful. In fact, they will thank you with a lot of money. However, even after 3 years, the protagonist sees that Kinchu has completely transformed into a vengeful spirit, and that bloodthirsty rage is revealed, rushed towards the sky, telling him that even he can't properly resolve the situation, and that he only has one solution, though it's not really a solution at all. And it's up to him to decide whether or not he's willing to go through with it. But since he wants to save his family, he tells the protagonist to go, something that leaves him very surprised, wondering, "What do you mean, a week?" And as the protagonist left, he told her to come with him, which she ended up doing, ahead, and that he's willing to listen to what he has to say. The protagonist, already aware of this, tells him that Kishu's death is the reason for his daughter becomes a ghost. Severo simply can't overcome his anger, and believes that if his daughter turns herself in to the police, he can alleviate half of your grievances, and then he can easily get her back. Well, he believes he will be able to get her back easily so that his daughter's sacrifice can protect his one family, and it's up to Mr. Huan and Mrs. One to decide that. Faced with this, the father asks the protagonist if he can do it another way, because he is willing to pay money as a thank you. But the protagonist interrupts him, saying that it seems he can't trust him. Then, standing up, he tells him that in that case, they are on their own, so he will leave. However, Mr. Wan, grabbing onto the protagonist, tells him that he misunderstood, and he didn't. He can leave, and looking at his daughter, he tells her the same thing he did before, that she simply had to give up. But she tells him that there's no way she will, since she's not going to go to jail, and he must take care of it for her, asking if he isn't as great as he claims, and questioning where his ability is. However, her father tells her to shut up and says that this is her fault, and he can't sacrifice the whole family because of her. But she continues to refuse, telling him that there was no way she was going to go. Her mother also tells her to give up for her brother's sake, but she pushes her away and do. After the protagonist left, they congratulated their boss, while wondering if a student knew what it meant to face a corporate war. Says again that she won't do it, and when she was planning to leave, her father stops her and tells her that she can't leave because if she does, her entire family will be buried with her. And as the protagonist and the ghost watched, They both thought it was a touching scene of a father's filial piety and daughter. After a while, the police finally arrived at the scene, and if you're wondering how they got there, well, I didn't mention it, but when Mr. One was holding his daughter, he asked his wife to call the police, and that's when she seized the opportunity and called them. The police, upon entering, immediately asked who had called them, to which Mr. One responded by saying that he was the one who called the police and wanted to report the case of Kim Sho, who fell from a cliff 3 years ago, and that the murderer is his daughter. 1. The girl's mother kept telling her not to blame herself, since they can't avoid it. Only by sacrificing themselves and their brother will they always be safe. But she, enraged, tells her mother that she will denounce them as well, since they covered up a murder, making them equally guilty. In response, her father, wanting to apologize, tells her not to talk nonsense, because they knew nothing about her scandal. At this, she burst out laughing and told her father, "Since you don't love me, you'll all die together, and no one will survive." To which, faced with all of this, the presidential police officer could only remark that the father was denouncing his daughter, and the daughter was denouncing her father, wondering if this, to a corporate war. The old man also questioned how Chief Chow could choose someone like the protagonist, while the other one said that family was drunk, but his partner responds with a question, asking if this is a display of great justice. The professional approaches him, tells them that it is indeed a great act of justice, considering that 3 years ago, Wang Ya pushed her friend off a cliff to her death, and her parents, they helped him conceal the crime until now. Today, they are at odds, and have begun exposing each other's crimes. While handing something over, he tells the police that all the evidence is there, and that they must take him to trial, where everything will become clear. Mr. Wan, outraged by what the protagonist was doing, asks if he simply wanted to harm his family, demanding to know who the hell the protagonist was. Something that the father replies he did all of that to avenge Kim Shu's death. With that said, both Mr. Wan, his wife, and his daughter ended up taking him to jail. In response, the police officer thanked the protagonist for providing clues that would help solve the case, but the protagonist simply replied, that's all he should do as an enthusiastic citizen. Well, an enthusiastic citizen. And after they take him away, the protagonist asks the ghost girl how she feels now that she's gotten revenge, to which she replies that her life is finally over, but she's also a little lost, which makes the protagonist ask her what she means by lost, asking her why she feels that way, a question to which the girl, they were telling him that his company is very unstable and they urgently need the protagonist's help and his return. These words leave everyone speechless, as there's no need to worry, as his own ambition will be his downfall. However, Lilita, who was listening to everything, didn't say a single word. Ghost responds to the protagonist that she feels as if she has suddenly lost her purpose, has no more hope, and now doesn't know how to exist. Strong in the future, but the protagonist, grabbing her cheek, tells her that his greatest goal is to serve her well, saying, so, as you. He helped quite a bit, so I should give him something in return. From now on, she was his pet, and he asked her if she was in agreement with that, which she ends up accepting, telling the protagonist that, from that moment on, she will belong only to him, and while she took off her blouse, she tells the protagonist that, for his visual pleasure, she will not wear clothes, but the protagonist stops her and tells her not to lower it so much, since he won't be able to concentrate on work with her like this. Nevertheless, the protagonist ends up receiving a call, and for the protagonist, the call came. He quickly asks what's happening, and the person on the call informs him that a television reporter is denigrating him online, claiming that the reporter is saying that the protagonist's impromptu fortune-telling that day was a fraudulent act, and is currently on El Paso Elevated 5 discussing it, asking what they should do and whether he should bring someone to confront the reporter. However, the protagonist finds this interesting because the fish bit so quickly, and therefore tells him not to do anything, as he will be right there. He looks at the girl and tells her that she has to go with him. Minutes later, the protagonist told Lita that he had been looking for her and asked her to tell him how Mr. Chow died, to play along, going to the reporter who was defaming the protagonist, who was surrounded by several people, and simultaneously, he was broadcasting, telling everyone to trust him, and that the half-mage was a liar, referring to the protagonist. He told the people watching that his name was Yang, a senior reporter for Metropolis Times, and that he was there that day to combat the fraud of someone pretending to be a god. However, one of the people there pointed and said that the master was there, meaning the protagonist had arrived. The people, looking at the protagonist, said he was very young, and wondered how he could be so accurate in his predictions, assuming that the protagonist just wanted to be an internet celebrity. However, the protagonist didn't care what they said, and sitting alone, he said, "Well, I was wondering if everyone was looking to make some predictions, and if so, who would dare to go first, especially the reporter who was slandering the." Approaching him, the protagonist tells him that the prediction will be for him first, which leads the protagonist to ask if he wants to know about his love life or his fortune. The reporter, with a smile on his face, tells the protagonist that he doesn't intend to predict the future for him, since that can be immediately disproven, telling him not to call himself a half-wizard and that he should just start, once and for all. However, the protagonist, which he answers, he had a car accident, and the police have already classified it as such, leading the protagonist to tell him that he says that it's very easy to do this, while thinking that this guy was very smart, because if he wanted to predict his future fortune, he would still have. Establishing the agreement and making a prediction is still not easy, but by touching him, the reporter will know everything. Upon hearing the protagonist say it was easy, he asks how it could be easy, since he believes the protagonist is panicking, and that is why he is saying all of that, daring anyone to try and predict the future. To shut him up, the protagonist decides to start, while telling him that, in that case, they are going to give it a try. The protagonist uses his ability on him and manages to see several scenes of when his mother scolded him for wetting the bed, when he was rejected, or even when he was looking at the behinds of girls in short skirts. However, the reporter ends up interrupting the protagonist. This is to tell him to stop pretending, and if he doesn't know something, to admit it gracefully, which will save him from humiliation, something the protagonist realizes upon seeing, who was really believing it, tells him that his name is Yang. He is 34 years old, and was born in Yanjin Village, in Koge City, and his father owns a restaurant and his mother works in a hospital. However, the protagonist knew he would be there to block him, and the protagonist researched his personal information in advance, and furthermore, everyone knows what he had said and he can exploit some fierce news, which makes he needed to tell him more about it. All the while, he was thinking that if it were just a simple car accident, the system wouldn't have asked him to investigate. Brutal character. Ask him how the news could be considered ferocious, questioning if he is sure, since he is afraid that it is not appropriate. Well, what? He will say what he's thinking about him, believing that he has already won the battle. Guron then tells all the people present that they can clearly see the protagonist is left with nothing. I mean, he has nothing to say, but the reporter forgot that the most important thing isn't just the battle, but the entire war. Therefore, the protagonist tells everyone, present that the reporter, even at the age of 13, still had to wear diapers to sleep at night until he was finally cured with a Chinese doctor's prescription, and that he also cheated on his third-year final exam and was caught by his teacher, yet still denied it and was almost expelled because of it. And, furthermore, he pursued a total of 12 girls in college, and all of them rejected him. But that wasn't all, as the protagonist continues, saying that he liked to spy on girls in short skirts, and his precious little movie is on the F drive of his computer. The file name is the journalist's self-cultivation notes, and his password is 5269, and looking at him seriously, the protagonist asks if that's all the information. Strong, asking him if that's enough. No, the protagonist is a total mastermind. The reporter, faced with this, is shocked by what the protagonist had just said, asking him if he was human or a ghost, because that was superhuman. The protagonist responds to he tells the protagonist that Mr. Chow was on his way to his office in the morning when he collided with a truck and died, and that the truck driver always drove. Reporter, telling him that of course he is human, and asking how there could be a ghost in broad daylight. The people who were there also, they were surprised, especially since the reporter himself confirmed what the protagonist had said. However, that wasn't the whole story, because the protagonist, he also tells him that, by the way, he helped predict his fortune well, his own fortune, telling him that he will face what awaits him if he makes things difficult, and he needs to remember to watch his step when he walks later. But he tells the protagonist that it was just a coincidence, that everything he said was simply chance. However, with the ghost's help, he ends up falling to the ground, which surprises everyone, because he actually fell. Seeing this, the people quickly approach the protagonist, asking him to please tell them about love and many other things. But the protagonist, getting up, tells him that everything is all right and that he will take them on one by one. However, as he passes by this girl, who, by the way, while watching the reporter's live broadcast, she is interrupted by her maid, who tells her that she needs to eat something, because if she continues like this, her body will collapse, and she won't be able to find that man, since she can't do it for him. However, she simply replies that she has no appetite, and, while watching the live video, where the protagonist was, she thought that maybe she could try. However, that's how we'll be ending this video. If you liked it, thank you for your like to bring, at that time, so it wasn't a deliberate accident. The protagonist asks where the driver is now, to which he responds, the next video faster, and crash, with nothing more to add, bye, bro. He replies that he is under police custody and must remain at the police station. The protagonist, still doubtful, tells him he wants him to go to the police station and to watch over the driver to prevent anything from happening to him, which prompts the driver to ask if he suspects something. The protagonist replies that it's better to be prepared for any eventuality. He finally understands the order and says he will do it immediately, then leaves, leaving the protagonist alone with his secretary, who, while handing him some documents, tells the protagonist that the director of the Thai group is already there and reviewing the documents. The